Hello there, precious soul who has found your way to this gentle refuge tonight. I can sense something in the very fact that you have paused here, in this quiet sanctuary we are creating together. That speaks of a heart carrying the weight of hours that have asked much of you, perhaps more than seemed reasonable for any one person to bear. Welcome to this sacred space where time moves according to different rhythms than those that have governed your day, where the relentless demands of your everyday world give way to something softer, something that speaks of rest and renewal and the kind of deep peace that touches places in your spirit you may have forgotten still existed beneath all the noise and hurry. You who have arrived here tonight, whether this marks your first discovery of this peaceful haven, or you have returned like a weary traveler coming home to a place that has sheltered you before, know that your presence here represents more than coincidence or casual browsing through options that compete for your attention. There is something beautiful about the way tired souls recognize each other across the vast spaces of our modern world, drawn together not by shared circumstances or similar backgrounds, but by shared understanding that we were created for more than the endless, cycling through obligations and anxieties that so often characterizes our waking hours. Take this moment now to simply become aware of where you find yourself, to feel whatever surface supports you completely and without condition. Whether it is the familiar embrace of your own bed, where you have wrestled with sleepless nights before, or perhaps a chair that has become your evening sanctuary, a place where you retreat when the noise of the world grows too loud and your soul cries out for the kind of silence that speaks more eloquently than any words could express about the deeper needs of human hearts that hunger for connection with something larger and more tender than their troubles. Allow your body to remember what it feels like to be held, to be supported without having to earn that support through effort or achievement or any form of striving that has become so automatic you barely notice how it exhausts every fiber of your being. Your physical form has served you faithfully throughout this day that is now drawing to its close, carrying you through conversations that may have drained your energy, through responsibilities that tested your patience, through moments of unexpected joy and periods of difficulty that seemed to stretch longer than seemed fair or bearable to hearts already carrying more than their share of life's complexities. But now in this sacred space we are sharing together, your body can finally rest, can finally remember that it was designed not for endless performance, but for peaceful dwelling in the love that breathes life into your lungs without your conscious participation, and keeps your heart beating with rhythms more ancient than your thoughts, more fundamental than your worries, more enduring than any circumstance that may have troubled your mind during the daylight hours that have finally given way to this blessed darkness that invites rest. Let us breathe together now, you and I, sharing these precious moments of conscious connection with the gift of life itself that flows through you every second of every day, whether you are aware of it or not. Draw in slowly and deeply through your nose, allowing your lungs to fill completely with air that carries more than oxygen into your being, air that carries possibility and hope and the whispered promise that rest is not only possible but absolutely essential for souls like yours, that give so much of themselves in service to others and to the demands of existence that never seem to decrease no matter how efficiently you try to manage them, or how hard you work to stay ahead of their accumulating. Wait, hold this breath gently for just a moment, not with tension that adds another task to your already burdened mind, but with the tender care you might use to cradle something infinitely precious, something that deserves your gentle attention and grateful recognition. Feel how your chest expands like doors opening to welcome long-awaited guests, how your ribs move outward to make room for this gift of breath that connects you to every living thing that shares this planet with you. How even this simple act of breathing becomes a prayer when offered with conscious awareness of its miraculous nature, and grateful acknowledgement of its source in love that sustains all existence. Now release this breath slowly through slightly parted lips, breathing out not just carbon dioxide, but every accumulated tension of hours that required more strength than you sometimes felt you possessed, more wisdom than you sometimes felt you could access, more patience than seemed humanly possible when faced with situations that tested every limit you thought you knew about yourself, and your capacity to handle whatever challenges life might place before you with grace and resilience. Again now, drawing in peace with each inhalation, drawing in the deep assurance that this moment belongs entirely to you, and to the love that has drawn you here for purposes that transcend your understanding, but serve your deepest need for connection with something infinitely larger and more reliable than your own efforts to hold everything together when it feels like the center cannot hold and things are falling apart faster than you can repair them or replace them or make sense of their breaking. Feel your chest filling with more than air as you breathe in recognition that you are held by arms that never grow weary, supported by love that never wavers, surrounded by grace that never runs out, no matter how many times you need to return to this well of refreshment for your thirsty soul that has been searching for satisfaction in places that promise much but deliver little of the lasting nourishment that hearts created in divine image require for true flourishing rather than mere survival from one challenging day to another. And as you exhale, release all the things you have been trying to control through worry and planning and careful management of details that multiply faster than solutions can be found. All the outcomes you have been concerned about despite your inability to determine them through human effort alone. All the people you have been trying to help or heal or understand in ways that exceed your capacity and drain your emotional resources while leaving you feeling inadequate to meet the endless needs that surround every compassionate heart living in a broken world. One more breath now, deeper and slower still, breathing in the knowledge that your presence in this quiet space represents exactly where you need to be at exactly this moment in your journey. That your decision to spend these precious evening hours in contemplation of eternal things, rather than consuming entertainment that demands nothing of your heart or mind, speaks to something beautiful awakening within you, some deep recognition that your spirit was created for communion with love itself, rather than settling for substitutes that promise fulfillment but leave you emptier than before. Notice how your breathing has begun to find its own perfect rhythm, without any conscious effort on your part, like waves discovering their eternal dance with shores that have welcomed them for countless centuries. Like your heart settling into the steady beat of someone who knows they are completely safe, completely loved, completely accepted exactly as they are in this moment, without needing to change anything about themselves to earn that acceptance or prove their worthiness to receive comfort offered so freely. You are not alone in this peaceful gathering tonight, dear friend. Though the darkness around you might tempt you to believe otherwise or whisper lies about isolation and abandonment that have no power over the truth that shines brighter than any darkness could ever overcome. All across our sleeping world, other hearts like yours have been drawn to this same sanctuary. Other souls who understand what it means to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of modern existence. Other spirits who hunger for the kind of nourishment that cannot be found in any earthly provision but flows abundantly from the source of all comfort and all hope and all love that never fails, who turn to it with open hearts and empty hands. Some who join us tonight have been walking pathways of contemplation for many years, their hearts familiar with these rhythms of grace, but always eager for fresh encounters with the love that first captured their attention and transformed their understanding of what it means to be fully alive in relationship with the one who created them for joy rather than endless striving, for peace rather than perpetual anxiety. For connection rather than isolation that masquerades as independence, but actually represents separation from the very relationships that give life its deepest meaning and richest satisfaction. Others may be newer to this kind of spiritual exploration, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed before as irrelevant to practical concerns of daily existence, drawn by longings they can barely name but cannot ignore. Pulled by hunger that has grown stronger with each passing year that has taught them earthly pleasures alone cannot satisfy the God-shaped emptiness within every human heart that recognizes its need for something beyond what this visible world can provide to souls created for relationship with invisible love. Whether you arrive as a seasoned pilgrim whose feet have walked many miles on spiritual journeys, or as a curious newcomer, taking tentative first steps toward mysteries that seem both attractive and intimidating, whether your faith feels strong tonight or fragile as morning mist that might dissipate with first harsh words or disappointing circumstances, whether you come with gratitude or with questions, with hope or with weariness that runs deeper than physical exhaustion, you belong here completely and without reservation. Tonight I am inviting you to join me on an extraordinary journey, a pilgrimage that will transport us across centuries and continents, to walk alongside the most remarkable person who has ever lived, to witness love in its purest form as it moved through our world clothed in human flesh, touching lives and transforming hearts in ways that continue to ripple through time like stones dropped into still water that create circles spreading far. Beyond the point of initial contact, reaching shores we cannot see but somehow trust exist because love has momentum that nothing can ultimately stop or diminish. We will not observe these sacred events from academic distance, like scholars studying ancient texts for historical accuracy or theological correctness, but we will experience them as beloved friends of the One, whose name has been drawing seeking hearts for more than 2,000 years, whose story continues to comfort the afflicted and challenge the comfortable, whose love remains as relevant and revolutionary today as it was when he first walked the dusty roads of Palestine and spoke words that turned the world upside down in the most wonderful way imaginable. Feel yourself beginning to release your hold on the familiar landmarks of contemporary life, the digital devices that keep you tethered to endless streams of information and obligation, the artificial lighting that banishes natural darkness, and the rhythms it brings to human hearts that have learned to live by schedules rather than seasons, the constant connectivity that promises community but often delivers isolation, the mechanical sounds that have become the soundtrack to modern existence but speak nothing of the deeper harmonies that govern creation itself. These sounds and sensations are fading now, becoming distant and unimportant as we prepare to step backward through the corridors of time into an era when people measured their days by the sun's journey across sky painted by divine artistry rather than by clocks that slice existence into manageable segments. When silence was not something to be filled, but something to be treasured. When rest was not a luxury to be earned, but a gift to be received with grateful hearts that understood their dependence upon grace for every breath and every heartbeat and every moment of consciousness that allows them to recognize beauty and experience wonder and offer praise to the source of all good things. Chapter 2. Journey into Sacred Lands. The transformation begins as gently as dawn breaking over hills that have witnessed 10,000 sunrises. My beloved companion, as we find ourselves leaving behind the processed surfaces and artificial environments of your contemporary world, stepping together across the threshold of time into a realm where life moved in harmony with rhythms older than human memory, where people understood their place in creation's grand symphony rather than fighting against natural patterns that connect all living things to the heartbeat of divine love that sustains every creature from the smallest sparrow to the mightiest cedar. From the humblest wildflower to the most magnificent mountain peak that reaches toward heaven with silent praise. Feel the ground beneath your feet, changing from the hard, unforgiving materials of modern construction to the natural textures of earth and stone that have supported human steps for generations beyond counting. Paths worn smooth by sandaled feet of shepherds, leading flocks to green pastures beside still waters, where reflection reveals not only their own faces, but glimpses of the one who created both the watchers and the watched. Who knows every sheep by name and cares for each with tenderness that human language cannot adequately express, but human hearts can recognize when they encounter it in unexpected places. The air itself seems to carry different qualities as we breathe together in this ancient landscape, cleaner and warmer than what fills your contemporary lungs, sweetened by herbs and flowers that grow wild across hillsides, where creation's original beauty still shows through despite humanity's repeated attempts to improve upon divine design through methods that often obscure rather than enhance the glory that was meant to shine through every created thing as testimony to the goodness of the one who looked upon all that he had made and declared it very good. This is the land of ancient promises and prophetic preparation, where rolling hills stretch toward horizons painted in colors that no earthly artist has ever fully captured, despite countless attempts to reproduce on canvas or photograph what can only be truly appreciated by hearts that have learned to see beauty as revelation rather than mere aesthetic pleasure. Hills covered with olive groves that have been tended by families for generations who understand their work as partnership with divine providence, cooperation with forces larger and wiser than human planning could ever comprehend or control. The olive trees themselves seem to hold memories in their twisted trunks that speak of patience and endurance, their silver-green leaves catching light in ways that transform ordinary moments into glimpses of glory. Their fruit destined to be pressed into oil that will illuminate homes and anoint heads, and carry prayers upward on smoke that rises from altars, where gratitude finds expression in forms as old as human awareness of divine blessing, as ancient as the first recognition that every good gift comes from above and deserves acknowledgement from hearts that have learned to distinguish between gift and giver. Listen carefully to the sounds filling this sacred landscape, so different from the mechanical noise that surrounds most contemporary existence. Sounds that speak of life lived in conscious dependence upon divine provision and seasonal rhythms that cannot be hurried or controlled through human effort alone. The gentle bleating of sheep creates pastoral melodies that speak of trust and care and the kind of security that comes from knowing you are led by one who loves you more than life itself and would never lead you anywhere that is not ultimately for your good, even when the path seems difficult or the destination unclear to eyes that can see only the next few steps ahead. From villages built of stone that came from this very ground comes the rhythmic sound of grain being ground between millstones worn smooth by countless harvests, of water being drawn from wells that have served these communities since their ancestors first settled here, with faith that divine guidance had led them to places where they could flourish and raise children who would know their God not as distant ruler, but as loving Father who provides for all their needs according to riches and glory that never diminish no matter how freely they are shared among those who recognize their source. These are communities where life flows according to patterns established long before anyone can remember, where children play games that require nothing more than imagination and the simple joy of being alive in a world full of wonders too numerous to count. Where mothers prepare meals from ingredients grown in their own soil and seasoned with love that transforms simple food into nourishment for both body and soul. Where fathers teach their sons skills passed down through generations, while daughters learn from their mothers the arts of creating home and nurturing life in all its precious forms. The rhythm of their days follows the natural cycle of light and darkness that speaks of divine order underlying apparent chaos, beginning with sunrise prayers that acknowledge the gift of another day and conclude with evening thanksgivings that recognize divine faithfulness, expressed through countless blessings large and small that faithful hearts notice and celebrate, while unfaithful hearts overlook and take for granted as if they had some right to expect good things without acknowledging their source in generous love. Watch the people of this blessed land as they move with different quality than the hurried masses of our modern age. Their steps unhurried because they understand that the most important destinations are not geographical but spiritual. Their eyes clear because they have learned to see beauty in simple things that cost nothing but reveal everything about the character of the one who made them beautiful, not for any practical purpose, but simply because beauty itself is good. And God delights in blessing His children with gifts that serve no purpose except to bring joy to hearts that have learned to receive joy as sacrament. Their faces are marked by sun and honest labor, but illuminated by something deeper than physical health, something that speaks of souls at peace with their place in creation's order, spirits that have found their rest not in accumulated possessions or impressive achievements, but in relationship with the one who knew them before they were formed in their mother's wombs and will love them long after their earthly journey has ended and their eternal journey has begun in realms where love reigns supreme and peace flows like a river that never runs dry. These are people who have maintained connection to rhythms that govern natural life, who plant according to seasons they did not create but have learned to trust, who harvest what they planted with gratitude that recognizes their dependence upon forces beyond their control for the sun and rain and soil fertility that no human effort can manufacture or guarantee. Their work connects them directly to creation's materials and processes, giving them understanding of divine partnership that city dwellers often miss despite their greater access to formal education and sophisticated technologies. Their religious life flows seamlessly through every aspect of daily existence, not compartmentalized into special buildings or designated hours, but woven through the fabric of ordinary moments, like golden thread through simple cloth that becomes magnificent precisely because of that sacred threading. Their prayers rise as naturally as their breathing, their awareness of divine presence as constant as their awareness of sunlight warming their faces or air filling their lungs, their trust in providential care as fundamental as their confidence that the ground will support their weight when they take their next step. The synagogues serving as centers of their spiritual community are built of the same materials as their homes, designed for gathering rather than impressing, for learning rather than displaying, for fostering relationship with the divine rather than creating hierarchies among human beings who are all equally loved and equally in need of grace that none can earn but all can receive through simple faith that trusts like a child trusts, loving parents to provide what is needed when it is needed in ways that serve good purposes even when those purposes are not immediately obvious to limited human understanding. Here children learn the ancient stories that connect them to their heritage and their destiny. Here adults wrestle with questions that have challenged human hearts since the beginning of thought itself. Here voices join in songs and prayers that carry both individual longing and collective hope toward heaven with confidence that they are heard and treasured by the one who created the very vocal cords that offer them in worship and supplication and thanksgiving for mercies that are new every morning because His faithfulness never fails those who put their trust in Him. As darkness deepens over this ancient landscape and oil lamps begin to flicker in windows that glow with warm welcome rather than harsh artificial illumination that banishes mystery along with darkness, you can sense anticipation in the very air itself. As if all creation holds its breath in expectation of something unprecedented, about to break into the predictable patterns of human history, like sunrise breaking into night, like spring breaking into winter, like hope breaking into despair that had seemed permanent, until love proved stronger than every force that opposes human flourishing. The stars appearing one by one in the clear desert sky seem brighter and closer than any stars visible from your modern vantage point, where artificial light pollution obscures the glory that was meant to declare divine handiwork to anyone with eyes to see, and hearts to wonder at the magnificent display that unfolds above their heads every clear night, as reliable as sunrise, as beautiful as anything human artists have ever created, as inspiring as any symphony human composers have ever written to express what words cannot contain about the majesty and glory of the one who scattered stars like diamonds across velvet and called it good. This is the world into which we are about to encounter, the one whose presence will transform everything it touches, whose words will echo through centuries and outlast every earthly kingdom, whose love will prove more powerful than death itself and more enduring than time. But for now we simply rest in the beauty and peace of the time and place that shaped his human understanding, allowing ourselves to be prepared by its rhythms and its reverence for the kind of encounter that changes hearts forever and heals souls wounded by living in a world that has forgotten its first love. Chapter 3. The Man from Nazareth. In the small hillside village of Nazareth, nestled among the green valleys of Galilee like a precious jewel set in a crown of natural splendor, where terraced gardens climbed slopes that caught morning light and held it like cupped hands holding liquid gold, there lived a young man whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere around him in ways that people noticed without being able to explain, whose ordinary appearance concealed mysteries that would soon transform not only individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human history itself, reshaping how humanity understood divine love and human purpose and the relationship between heaven and earth. His name was Jesus, though those who knew him in his youth would have called him by the Hebrew Yeshua. And while his hands bore the honest calluses earned through years of working with wood and stone under the patient guidance of his earthly father, while his face carried the warm bronze of Mediterranean sun, his eyes reflected the deep earth tones of soil that had nourished him from childhood. There was something in his gaze that made even casual observers pause and look again. Something that spoke of depths beyond human measurement and love beyond human comprehension or explanation. He had grown up walking these same narrow streets where children still play games their ancestors played centuries before, learning his first lessons about human nature and divine love from parents whose extraordinary faithfulness had already marked them as different in a community where faithfulness was not rare, but where their particular quality of surrender to divine will created ripples that touched every life that came into contact with their humble household, where miracles were welcomed as naturally as sunrise and mysteries were embraced rather than analyzed until their wonder was dissected away. Joseph, the village carpenter whose workshop echoed with sounds of creation and restoration, had taught his adopted son that broken things could always be mended with sufficient patience and skill, that raw materials possessed potential that could only be realized through careful attention and persistent love applied day after day until what had been merely functional became beautiful. What had been adequate became excellent. What had been ordinary became extraordinary through the touch of hands that understood their work as worship and their skill as stewardship of divine gifts. In that workshop filled with wood shavings that curled like prayers rising toward heaven, among tools worn smooth by generations of craftsmen who had learned to see their work as partnership with the divine creator, among projects that would serve families for decades to come with sturdy reliability that spoke of integrity built into every joint and corner, Jesus absorbed understanding that would later flower into parables about building on foundations solid enough to withstand storms. about trees being known by fruit they produce rather than promises they make, about patience required for any work that truly matters taking time that seems excessive to hurried hearts. Mary, his mother, whose heart had been stretched wide enough to contain mysteries that would have crushed lesser souls, had demonstrated through every word and action what it meant to trust completely in purposes larger than human understanding. To say yes to divine plans that challenged every conventional expectation about how divine power operates in human affairs. To carry with grace secrets too wonderful to share, yet too powerful to hide, completely from those who had eyes to see and hearts prepared to recognize. Divine work even when it came clothed in humility rather than majesty. Her quiet strength and unshakable peace had provided the stable foundation from which Jesus would launch a ministry that would reach every corner of the earth and extend through every generation until time itself gives way to eternity, where all questions find their answers and all longings discover their fulfillment in the presence of love itself. Where partial understanding gives way to complete knowledge and shadows give way to substance, and hope gives way to reality more wonderful than any earthly heart has ever dared to imagine. Even as a boy whose questions during synagogue discussions revealed understanding that amazed learned men accustomed to children who fidgeted during long readings and longer explanations. There had been something that set Jesus apart from his companions in ways that only became clear to those who looked back years later with the gift of hindsight, illuminated by events that would demonstrate conclusively who this carpenter's son really was beneath the humble exterior that concealed glories too bright for human eyes to behold directly, without being overwhelmed by beauty that would stop hearts and steal breath and leave observers unable to speak or move or think of anything except wonder. Village elders remembered conversations that carried weight beyond their simple words, discussions that revealed layers of meaning they had never suspected existed in familiar texts. They thought they understood completely after decades of study and meditation, questions that penetrated to hearts of matters that had puzzled rabbis for generations. Cutting through centuries of commentary and debate to expose truths, so simple that children could grasp them, yet so profound that scholars would spend lifetimes exploring depths they had glimpsed in moments of clarity granted by grace rather than earned through effort. When Jesus listened to ancient stories in the synagogue where his ancestors had gathered for centuries to remember their identity as chosen people, his attention was so complete and his insights so penetrating that grown men found themselves seeing familiar narratives with fresh eyes, discovering connections they had never noticed, understanding implications that had remained hidden until illuminated by observations that seemed to come from someone who had been present when these events originally occurred, who knew the characters involved not as historical figures, but as living friends whose struggles and triumphs held personal meaning. The religious authorities of his day, men who had dedicated their entire lives to memorizing intricate details of scriptural law and rabbinic commentary that had grown like coral reefs around original texts, would eventually struggle to categorize this carpenter who spoke with authority they could not match despite their impressive credentials and institutional positions that normally commanded automatic respect from ordinary people who had neither time nor training to master complex theological distinctions that often obscured rather than clarified simple truths. These learned men inhabited a religious world that had become complicated beyond recognition, layered with rules and regulations that often seemed designed more to exclude than include, to burden rather than bless, to create hierarchies of worthiness that separated the supposedly righteous from the obviously sinful rather than revealing the divine love that embraces all humanity without distinction based on external performance or internal perfection that no human being has ever achieved through effort alone. no matter how sincere or sustained or sacrificial that effort might prove to be. Jesus had grown up observing how ordinary people struggled under spiritual weights they were never meant to carry alone, watching how light faded from eyes that had once sparkled with hope when souls felt disconnected from the God they longed to know and serve, but could not seem to please no matter how hard they tried to follow rules that multiplied faster than human ability to remember them all, much less observe them perfectly in the midst of lives filled with practical concerns about earning daily bread and caring for families and dealing with neighbors whose own struggles sometimes made them difficult to love. He witnessed shoulders sagging beneath burdens that religious authorities kept adding rather than lifting, observed hearts growing cold under the weight of expectations that crushed rather than inspired, saw spirits withering under judgment that condemned rather than redeemed, that pointed out failures without offering hope for transformation, that demanded perfection while providing no power to achieve it except through human effort, that proved insufficient again and again, until people began to believe that divine love must be reserved for those fortunate enough to be born with naturally righteous inclinations. Yet there was something in Jesus that remained undimmed by the spiritual darkness he observed around him, a light that seemed to grow brighter rather than dimmer when confronted with human confusion and pain, and the systematic attempts to obscure divine truth beneath human tradition that served institutional interests more than divine purposes or human needs, crying out for compassionate response rather than additional requirements to fulfill or standards to meet or hoops to jump through before they could be deemed worthy of divine attention. The political atmosphere of his time was thick with tension and uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life in ways both obvious and subtle, creating an environment where hope was dangerous and trust was rare, because those who dared to believe in better possibilities often found themselves crushed beneath systems designed to maintain control rather than promote human flourishing, according to divine intention that sees every person as precious and every life as sacred, regardless of social status or economic position or political affiliation or religious performance. Roman soldiers marched through Jewish streets with confident arrogance of occupying forces, their presence constant reminder that this promised land was currently under foreign control, their demands for taxes and compliance leaving families struggling to maintain both physical survival and spiritual integrity in circumstances that seemed designed to test faith beyond its breaking point, to force choices between earthly survival and heavenly loyalty that no one should ever have to make, but which became daily reality for people caught between competing demands. Into this world of political oppression and religious confusion, Jesus would soon step with a message so simple it seemed naive to sophisticated minds, yet so radical it would turn established order upside down in the most wonderful way possible, demonstrating that the kingdom of heaven advances not through violence or political maneuvering, but through revolutionary power of unconditional love expressed in practical service to anyone who needed healing, hope, or simply assurance that they mattered to someone who would never abandon them, regardless of their past mistakes or present circumstances or future fears. Chapter 4. The beginning of something sacred. The morning sun was painting the eastern sky in watercolors of coral and amber when Jesus made his way through terrain that grew progressively more wild and rocky as he approached the banks of the Jordan River, where crowds had been gathering for weeks to hear the powerful proclamations of a desert prophet, whose message of preparation and transformation had stirred hearts throughout Palestine and beyond its borders, drawing people from every level of society who sensed that something unprecedented was stirring in the spiritual atmosphere of their time, something that demanded response deeper than curiosity or intellectual interest, but required the kind of heart change that could only come through divine encounter with truth that set souls free. This was John, called the Baptist, who had grown up in wilderness places far from comfortable compromises of city life, sustained by locusts and wild honey that spoke of dependence upon divine provision rather than human planning, clothed in camel's hair that announced his separation from soft luxuries that so often accompany spiritual compromise. His entire being radiating intensity of someone who had spent years in solitude, learning to distinguish voice of the Almighty from countless other voices that compete for human attention in a world full of distractions, designed to keep souls from quiet contemplation necessary for divine communication. The Baptist's voice carried across flowing water with authority of ancient prophecy being fulfilled in real time before eyes of anyone, with spiritual perception to recognize what was happening, calling people not to mere modification of behavior but to complete transformation of heart and mind and purpose, challenging them to genuine repentance that went far deeper than external observance of religious customs that had lost their power to change lives because they had been divorced from love. That was supposed to flow through every commandment like life-giving water through channels. The multitudes that came to him represented every stratum of Palestinian society, wealthy merchants whose success had not filled emptiness in their souls, desperate beggars whose poverty had taught them truths about dependence that prosperity often obscures, learned scribes whose knowledge had somehow failed to produce wisdom they sought, simple farmers whose closeness to soil and seasons had prepared their hearts to recognize authentic spiritual authority when they encountered it, all sensing that this wild-looking prophet spoke truths their hearts had been longing to hear. Tax collectors who had grown comfortable with their collaboration with Roman authorities, their betrayal of their own people in exchange for financial security that had cost them their souls, found themselves under conviction so powerful they could no longer pretend that prosperity purchased through compromise was worth the price they had paid in self-respect and community standing. Their questions to John revealed hearts that had not been completely hardened by years of moral flexibility, souls that still remembered what integrity felt like and longed to experience again, peace that comes from alignment between beliefs and actions. Soldiers trained in violence and intimidation, men whose profession required them to think in terms of enemies and threats, whose survival depended on readiness to inflict pain and death upon others who might challenge their authority or threaten their interests, asked what they must do to live lives pleasing to the God they had been taught to fear but had never learned to love. Their weapons temporarily set aside as they contemplated revolutionary possibility that there might be different ways to find security and meaning than through application of force. Religious leaders arrived to investigate this new teacher, some with genuinely seeking hearts that had grown weary of empty rituals and meaningless ceremonies that satisfied neither divine requirements nor human longings. Others with suspicious minds already prepared to find fault with anyone whose message challenged their carefully maintained positions of authority and influence within systems that served their personal interests more than they served divine purposes or human needs, crying out for compassionate response. The baptism that John offered in muddy waters of Jordan was far more than ritual washing designed to fulfill religious requirements or satisfy ceremonial obligations, but rather powerful symbol of death and rebirth that spoke to something deeper than surface cleanliness, representing complete transformation that begins when old life is buried beneath waters that close over heads full of regrets and emerges, dripping with possibilities for new beginnings that God's grace makes available to anyone willing to admit their need for cleansing they cannot provide for themselves. Those who submitted to this baptism were acknowledging publicly their recognition that they needed cleansing from sins that stained souls more deeply than dirt stains clothing, that they hungered for righteousness they could not achieve through human effort alone, that they were ready to participate in divine purposes that transcended their individual understanding and personal ambitions and comfortable assumptions. about how life should be lived and what God required from human beings who claimed to love Him. Then came a morning that began like so many others, but would be remembered as long as human hearts beat with hope for redemption, as long as souls search for meaning beyond material success and temporary pleasure, as long as creation groans for liberation that only divine intervention can provide. Jesus appeared among crowd gathered at river's edge, not as spectator observing religious phenomenon from safe distance, but as participant, seeking to identify completely with humanity's need for purification and renewal. When John saw him approaching through multitude of people pressing toward water, something in Baptist spirit recognized immediately that this was moment for which his entire ministry had been preparation. Arrival of one whose coming he had been announcing with prophetic certainty, though he had never seen his face until this historic morning that would divide human history into before and after, into prophecy and fulfillment, into shadow and substance, into promise and reality, walking among them in flesh and blood. John's initial protest revealed his intuitive grasp of cosmic reversal taking place before his eyes, his recognition that in presence of this particular candidate for baptism, all normal categories and expectations were being turned upside down, that he was one who needed what Jesus had to offer rather than other way around. That servant was suddenly face to face with his master. Forerunner confronting one whose way he had been preparing through months of preaching that had drawn thousands to these muddy banks. But Jesus insisted gently that this baptism was necessary, not because he needed cleansing, but because he needed to demonstrate complete identification with human experience, including longing for purification that drives souls to seek renewal they cannot achieve through their own efforts. Hunger for righteousness that can only be satisfied by divine intervention in hearts that have tried everything else and found it wanting. "Let it be so now," he said, his words carrying authority that made John's protests melt away like morning mist before rising sun. As Jesus descended into Jordan's flowing waters that had witnessed so many symbolic deaths and rebirths, very atmosphere around river seemed to shimmer with anticipation, as if all creation recognized that something unprecedented was occurring. Something that would mark beginning of ministry, destined to transform not just individual lives, but entire trajectory of human history. Relationship between heaven and earth. Understanding of what divine love looks like when it takes human form and walks among mortals. When Jesus emerged from water, droplets streaming from his hair and beard, but his face radiant with something far more significant than physical refreshment. Heavens opened in a way that several witnesses would later describe as more profound than any natural phenomenon they had ever observed in lifetimes spent watching weather patterns and seasonal changes that governed agricultural cycles and daily routines, but had never prepared them for supernatural intervention that revealed dimensions of reality normally hidden from human perception. Spirit of living God descended upon him in form of dove, that ancient symbol of peace and new beginnings whose gentle landing upon his head spoke of divine approval, so complete it needed no words to communicate what every heart present understood intuitively, that this was beloved in whom divine love found perfect expression. Son in whom paternal pride reached its fullest satisfaction, one through whom eternal purposes would be accomplished, despite temporary appearances of failure that would test faith of everyone who chose to follow him. Then came voice, audible to some though not to all, words that revealed eternal relationship between Father and Son, while announcing to anyone with ears to hear that long-awaited time had finally arrived. That centuries of prophecy were about to find their fulfillment in this carpenter from Nazareth, who had just submitted to baptism like any other repentant sinner, despite his complete freedom from anything requiring forgiveness or cleansing or transformation, except in sense that his human nature needed to experience everything that makes human existence what it is. "This is my beloved Son," voice declared with authority that echoed across water and through centuries to every heart that has ever wondered about its standing before a throne of infinite holiness, "in whom I am well pleased." These words carried hope to every soul that has questioned whether divine love could possibly extend to failures and disappointments that seem too numerous to count, too shameful to confess, too persistent to overcome through human effort, that always falls short of perfect righteousness required for fellowship with perfectly holy God. Chapter 5. Words that changed everything on a hillside that rose gently from northwestern shore of Sea of Galilee, where wildflowers carpeted the grass in brilliant tapestries of scarlet and gold and purple that spoke of divine artistry too magnificent for human duplication. Where morning air carried fresh sweetness of water and growing things that had never known pollution of industrial progress, Jesus found perfect natural amphitheater for words that would echo through centuries and transform countless hearts long after flowers had faded and new generations of blossoms had taken their place in endless cycles of beauty that teach patient hearts about renewal and hope and faithfulness of divine love that never fails to provide exactly what each season requires. The crowd that had gathered to hear this rabbi, whose teaching carried power unlike anything they had experienced in synagogues, where learned men quoted other learned men in chains of interpretation that often obscured rather than illuminated truths their souls desperately needed to hear, represented every level of Palestinian society in mixture that would have been remarkable in any other context. Wealthy merchants sat beside poor laborers whose calloused hands spoke of honest work that earned barely enough to feed their families. Learned scribes found themselves surrounded by illiterate farmers, whose closeness to soil and seasons had taught them wisdom that no amount of book learning could provide. What united this diverse assembly was not social status or educational background or economic position, but hunger they all recognized in each other's faces, longing for something their souls knew they needed, but their minds struggled to name or define or locate in a world that offered many forms of temporary satisfaction, but seemed incapable of providing lasting peace that hearts created in divine image require for true flourishing, rather than mere survival from one day to next, hoping that tomorrow might bring fulfillment that today had promised, but failed to deliver. When Jesus began to speak, his words fell into expectant silence like seeds, into soil that had been prepared by suffering and disappointment and years of religious instruction that had somehow failed to produce righteousness it promised or joy it proclaimed or peace it claimed was available to anyone willing to follow rules that seemed designed more to exclude than include, more to burden than bless, more to demonstrate human inadequacy than divine sufficiency for every need that drives souls to seek something beyond what earth can provide. Each phrase he spoke carried both immediate comfort for hearts weary of striving without achieving, and long-term challenge that would require complete transformation of values and priorities, and assumptions about what constitutes true success, genuine happiness, lasting security in a world where everything people typically trust eventually proves inadequate to bear weight of ultimate hope that human hearts place upon finite things that were never designed to carry such enormous expectations. He did not speak in technical language that religious professionals used to display their expertise or impress congregations with their learning. Nor did he employ elaborate rhetoric that political leaders used to manipulate emotions and secure support for policies that served their interests more than common good. Instead, his words were so simple that children could understand their surface meaning, yet so profound that wisest philosophers would spend lifetimes exploring depths they had glimpsed in moments of insight granted by grace rather than achieved through academic study. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he began, and immediately world's understanding of blessing was revolutionized in ways that challenged every assumption people had made about divine favor and human worthiness. In culture that equated material prosperity with spiritual blessing and interpreted earthly success as evidence of heavenly approval, Jesus was declaring that those who recognized their spiritual poverty, their complete inadequacy to meet divine standards through their own efforts, their desperate need for grace they could not earn or deserve, were ones most positioned to receive infinite wealth of divine love. The kingdom of heaven, he explained with authority that came from personal knowledge rather than theoretical speculation, belonged to them not despite their emptiness, but because of their readiness to be filled with divine righteousness they could never achieve through human effort, divine love they could never earn through perfect performance, divine acceptance they could never secure through flawless obedience to laws that revealed their need without providing their supply. Blessed are those who mourn, he continued, his voice carrying comfort that penetrated hearts carrying grief so deep they had wondered if joy would ever return to lives that had been shattered by losses too painful to accept, too final to reverse, too devastating to understand in any framework that made sense of divine goodness in a world where such terrible things happened to people who had tried to live faithfully and love generously and trust completely. Their tears were not evidence of divine displeasure or spiritual failure, but precious offerings treasured by heaven with intimate care that notices every drop and remembers every sorrow and promises healing for broken hearts that human comfort cannot reach and human wisdom cannot explain, and human strength cannot restore to wholeness. Sorrow itself, in mysterious economy of divine love, became pathway to comfort that could only come from ultimate source of consolation. Blessed are the meek, Jesus declared with quiet authority that demonstrated very quality he was describing, transforming gentleness from weakness into strength and humility, from failure into path, to true greatness that lasts beyond earthly recognition or reward. In society where power belonged to those willing to seize it through force or cunning, where success required aggressive self-promotion and ruthless elimination of competition, Jesus was revealing that ultimate victory belonged to those whose strength expressed itself through tenderness toward vulnerable and service to those in need. Earth itself, he promised with certainty that carried weight of divine decree, would ultimately belong not to those who grasped for territory through violence or accumulated possessions through greed or dominated others through manipulation, but to those whose gentle spirits reflected character of divine love that conquers through service rather than force, that leads through example rather than coercion, that transforms enemies into friends through persistent kindness that eventually melts hardest hearts. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, he proclaimed to hearts that had grown weary of their own moral failures and desperate for kind of goodness that seemed forever beyond their reach despite sincere efforts to live according to divine standards that exposed their inadequacy while providing no power to achieve what they demanded. For they will be filled, he promised, not through their own efforts to generate righteousness, but through divine gift of righteousness that comes to those who recognize their need and open their hearts to receive what they could never earn or deserve. This was not righteousness produced by human effort or religious performance, but righteousness that flowed from relationship with one who is righteous and shares his righteousness with anyone willing to receive it through faith that trusts completely in divine grace rather than human achievement. The filling he promised would satisfy every spiritual hunger and quench every spiritual thirst with satisfaction that no earthly pleasure could provide and no human achievement could match. Blessed are the merciful, Jesus taught with authority that would soon be demonstrated through his own merciful treatment of everyone who came to him seeking forgiveness or healing or simply acceptance they had been unable to find anywhere else in the world that seemed determined to judge and condemn and exclude, rather than embrace and restore and welcome home those who had wandered far from love. For they will be shown mercy, he promised, revealing divine principle that mercy given creates mercy received, that forgiveness offered opens hearts to receive forgiveness, that grace extended to others becomes grace experienced in return. This was not merely practical advice about getting along with difficult people or maintaining peaceful relationships with neighbors who sometimes proved challenging to love, but revelation of how divine mercy operates in human relationships and human hearts that have learned to see others through lens of divine compassion rather than human judgment, that focuses on failures and shortcomings rather than potential and possibilities that divine love sees in everyone. Blessed are the pure in heart, he declared to souls that had been stained by choices they regretted and thoughts they could not control, and desires that pulled them away from goodness they wanted to embrace, but found difficult to maintain in a world that offered so many temptations and distractions, and alternative definitions of success and happiness. For they will see God, he promised, revealing that purity of heart was not perfection of performance, but singleness of desire that sought divine will above all else. This seeing was not physical vision, but spiritual perception that recognizes divine presence and activity in ordinary circumstances of daily life, that discerns divine love behind apparent coincidences and seeming setbacks, that finds divine purpose in experiences that might appear random or meaningless to hearts that have not learned to see everything through lens of faith, that trusts divine goodness even when circumstances suggest reasons for doubt. Chapter 6. Miracles of Compassion as Word of Jesus is extraordinary. Teachings spread like ripples across still surface of Galilee's social landscape, reaching into villages and towns where stories of hope and healing traveled faster than any Roman messenger could carry official dispatches, where conversations around wells and in marketplaces began to center on this carpenter-turned-teacher whose words carried weight that pressed against hearts and opened them to possibilities they had never dared imagine. Something else began to happen that amazed everyone who witnessed it firsthand or heard reliable accounts from neighbors whose integrity vouched for truth of testimonies that challenged every natural law, yet were corroborated by too many credible witnesses to dismiss. The same divine power that flowed through his teachings like living water through channels that had been dry for generations began manifesting itself in healings and restorations that defied medical explanation while demonstrating heart of divine love toward every form of suffering that mars beauty of creation and breaks hearts of creatures made an image of perfect wholeness. These were not theatrical displays designed to impress crowds or validate theological credentials or establish institutional authority, but spontaneous responses to human need that revealed what divine compassion looks like when it encounters pain and brokenness. In busy fishing village of Capernaum, where morning air carried mingled scents of nets drying in, Mediterranean sun and bread baking in ovens tended by women whose hands had learned to transform simple grain into nourishment that sustained families through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, a Roman centurion's beloved servant lay dying on bed that had become his prison, consumed by fever that burned away his strength and paralysis that stole his mobility, leaving him completely dependent on others for every need. This military officer, though representing occupying forces that many Jews regarded as enemies of everything they held sacred, had somehow transcended ethnic and political barriers that typically separated conqueror from conquered, by demonstrating fairness in his dealings and genuine care for people under his authority that went far beyond mere professional duty or calculated self-interest. His love for Jewish customs and respect for Jewish faith had moved him to fund construction of their local synagogue with his own resources. When news reached him that Jesus was approaching Capernaum, something in Centurion's spirit recognized that this teacher from Nazareth possessed authority of completely different kind than any earthly power. He had known in years of military service under various commanders who wielded authority through force and maintained discipline through fear of punishment that might range from loss of pay to loss of life, depending on severity of offense and mood of superior officers. His faith was so profound and his understanding of spiritual authority so clear that he sent word to Jesus through Jewish elders who could vouch for his character, explaining that there was no need for teacher to actually visit his house where ceremonial defilement might result from contact with Gentile dwelling. That he need only speak word from whatever distance seemed appropriate, and healing would occur as surely as soldiers obeyed commands from legitimate authority. I myself am man under authority, he explained through his messengers with insight that amazed even Jesus with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. Just say word, and my servant will be healed. His understanding of how authority operates in spiritual realm paralleled his experience with military hierarchy, where commands were issued with confidence that they would be obeyed and received with certainty, that compliance was required by structure itself. The faith demonstrated by this Gentile soldier amazed even Jesus, who declared to Jewish crowds following him that he had not found such trust anywhere in Israel among people who had been raised from childhood with stories of divine power and miraculous interventions that should have prepared them to recognize supernatural authority when it appeared among them in human form. This Ramon understood something about divine power that escaped many who had spent entire lives studying scriptures. At very moment Jesus spoke words of healing from miles away, without any physical contact or medical intervention or gradual process of recovery that might be explained through natural means. Centurion's servant opened eyes that had been closed in semi-conscious delirium, sat up in bed that had seemed destined to become his deathbed, asked for food with appetite that had been absent for weeks, and discovered that both fever and paralysis had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. On another day, as Jesus was teaching beside shore, where fishing boats bobbed gently in shallow water that reflected sky so perfectly it was difficult to tell where heaven ended and earth began, where children played in sand while their mothers listened to words that spoke to longings buried so deep in their hearts they had almost forgotten such longings existed. Woman who had suffered from hemorrhaging for 12 long years pressed through crowd that surrounded him like living wall. She had spent everything she owned on physicians whose treatments had only made her condition worse through procedures that promised much but delivered additional pain while draining her financial resources and leaving her not only physically weaker but economically devastated, socially isolated by religious laws that declared her ceremonially unclean, and therefore unable to participate in community, worship or family celebrations or normal interactions that give life meaning and purpose. For over decades she had lived as exile in her own town, watching life go by from margins where shame and physical suffering had relegated her, growing progressively weaker while her hope dwindled to barely visible flicker that threatened to be extinguished completely by next medical setback or financial crisis or social rejection that reminded her how completely her condition had separated her from everything that makes existence bearable, let alone enjoyable. But reports about Jesus had reached even shadows where outcasts dwell, stories of compassion extended to sinners and grace offered to those whom religious authorities had declared beyond divine concern, accounts of healing that restored not just physical function, but social standing and spiritual connection and hope for futures worth living. Her faith was desperate but certain, born from kind of hope that emerges only when every other option has been exhausted, yet something in soul refuses to surrender completely to despair. If I can just touch edge of his garment, she whispered to herself as she pushed through crowd with determination, fueled by 12 years of longing for freedom from condition that had stolen her dignity along with her health. I know I will be healed. When her trembling fingers barely grazed hem of his cloak as he passed by, divine power flowed from Jesus like electricity seeking ground. And immediately she felt hemorrhaging stop with finality that convinced her healing was complete and permanent. Jesus, sensing that healing power had gone out from him like river flowing toward thirsty ground, stopped walking and turned the crowd with question, born not of irritation but of desire to complete what had begun with physical healing, by adding blessing of personal recognition and restored dignity that would matter as much as bodily restoration. "Who touched me?" he asked gently, his question revealing heart that cared not only about miracles, but about people who received them. When woman came forward, terrified yet compelled by kindness in his voice, expecting rebuke for her presumption, but receiving instead words that transformed her understanding of her own worth and place in community of faith, Jesus looked at her with infinite tenderness and spoke recognition that welcomed her back into human family from which disease and religious law had exiled her for far too long. "Daughter," he said, and in that single word she was no longer outcast or unclean woman or social pariah, but daughter welcomed home after long absence, family member whose place at table had been kept waiting for her return, beloved child whose worth had never been diminished in eyes of Heavenly Father, despite what earthly circumstances had seemed to suggest about her value and acceptability. "Your faith has healed you," Jesus continued, attributing miracle not to his power alone, but to trust she had demonstrated in approaching him despite every social and religious barrier that should have kept her away. Faith that had reached across gulf of separation to touch hem of one who had come specifically to heal broken-hearted and bind up wounded spirits wherever they might be found. "Go in peace and be freed from your suffering," he added, sending her away not just physically healed, but spiritually restored to fullness of life and relationship that her condition had stolen. The miracles multiplied day after day, each one revealing not just divine power, but divine heart that could not remain unmoved by human suffering in any form it took. Power that expressed itself not in spectacular displays designed to impress observers, but in quiet acts of restoration. Chapter 7. Walking among the people, what distinguished Jesus' ministry from every other religious movement of his time? What set him apart from countless other teachers and prophets and reformers who appeared throughout Palestine claiming divine authority for their particular interpretations of ancient texts, or their specific programs for spiritual renewal, was not merely power of his teachings or wonder of his miracles. Though both were extraordinary beyond anything his contemporaries had ever witnessed or imagined possible within boundaries of human experience. The truly revolutionary aspect of his approach was way he moved through world like someone who belonged everywhere and was welcome nowhere. People he chose to spend time with when he could have surrounded himself with influential supporters and wealthy patrons. Social barriers he consistently crossed with such natural grace that observers were left breathless by casual way. He dismantled centuries of carefully constructed divisions simply by treating every person as if they possessed infinite worth in eyes of divine love. In bustling marketplaces where merchants hawked their wares under colorful awnings that provided relief from Mediterranean sun, where air filled with sounds of bargaining conducted in multiple languages by people whose diverse backgrounds reflected Galilee's position as crossroads between different cultures and civilizations, where children darted between stalls displaying everything from fresh fish to imported spices, while women balanced water jars with practiced grace. Jesus walked with relaxed familiarity of someone completely comfortable among ordinary people living ordinary lives. Unlike religious leaders who maintained careful distance from anyone whose contact might compromise their ritual purity or threaten their social standing with authorities who valued conformity more than compassion and order more than justice. Jesus seemed to genuinely enjoy company of tax collectors whose collaboration with Roman occupation forces had made them wealthy but miserable, of fishermen whose honest labor connected them to rhythms older than human memory, of former prostitutes whose past provided no barrier to present transformation. He would pause at potters' workshops where skilled hands shaped clay into vessels useful and beautiful, examining their work with genuine interest while asking questions that revealed not condescension, but authentic curiosity about crafts that had been passed down through generations of families whose understanding of their work transcended mere economics to embrace something closer to worship, to partnership with creative forces that turn earth into art. At bakers' stalls were warm fragrances of fresh bread, mixed with conversations about weather and politics and community news that connected neighbors to shared life that extended beyond individual concerns to encompass collective hopes and fears and dreams. Jesus would breathe deeply of scents that reminded him of his mother's kitchen, where love was expressed through meals prepared with care that nourished more than bodies. His words transformed everyday experiences into windows through which listeners could glimpse eternal realities normally hidden behind veils of familiarity that make miraculous seem mundane, and sacred appear ordinary until someone with eyes to see and voice to explain reveals depths of meaning that had been present all along, but required divine revelation to become visible to hearts that had grown accustomed to surface appearances. Children seemed especially drawn to Jesus with instinctive recognition that bypassed intellectual analysis and went straight to heart's understanding of who could be trusted with fears and dreams and questions that adults often dismissed as unimportant or naive, but which actually represented purest expressions of human need for love that accepts without condition, guidance that leads without manipulation, protection that never fails even when circumstances suggest otherwise. They sensed in him kind of adult who would listen to their concerns without condescension, who would enter into their games without embarrassment, who would take seriously their observations about life that often revealed truths that sophisticated minds had overlooked or dismissed as childish simplicity. When his disciples attempted to discourage such interruptions, thinking their master's time was too valuable to be spent on those who could contribute nothing to his mission, Jesus' response revealed heart of his entire approach. "Let little children come to me," he said with authority that stopped his disciples' protective intervention, while revealing truth they had not yet grasped about nature of kingdom he had come to establish, and do not hinder them. For kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these, in their unguarded trust that had not yet learned to doubt promises made by those who claim to love them, in their capacity for wonder that found miracles in ordinary moments. Jesus found perfect illustrations of faith that opens hearts to receive divine love without reservation. He would sit on ground with them, regardless of dust that gathered on robes that marked him as teacher deserving respect, listening to their excited chatter about treasures they had discovered or adventures they had imagined, entering into their world with such genuine delight that they forgot he was anyone other than friend who cared about what mattered to them and understood that sometimes what matters most to children reveals truths that escape adult attention. Their presence reminded everyone watching that Jesus valued people not for what they could contribute to his cause, but for who they were as beloved children of Heavenly Father, whose love extends to everyone, regardless of age or status or usefulness in advancing earthly agendas that forget divine priorities revealed through incarnate love that chose weakness over power, service over domination, children over kings as representatives of values that will ultimately triumph. When Samaritan woman approached Jacob's well during noon heat, timing her visit to avoid other women who normally gathered there in cooler morning hours, she expected to draw her water in solitude and return home without encountering anyone who might remind her of shame and disappointment that had marked her recent years with series of failed relationships that had left her isolated even among people who were themselves outcasts from Jewish perspective. The last thing she anticipated was finding Jewish rabbi sitting beside well, and she certainly never imagined that he would speak to her, let alone ask her for drink of water, in violation of every social convention governing interactions between Jews and Samaritans, men and women, religious teachers and social outcasts, whose very presence was considered contaminating by those who prided themselves on ritual purity and moral superiority. The conversation that unfolded revealed both Jesus' supernatural knowledge of her personal history and his profound compassion for loneliness and searching that had driven her from one relationship to another in futile attempt to find someone who could satisfy deep thirst of her heart for love that would never disappoint or abandon her when difficulties arose or novelty wore off and human limitations became apparent. Instead of condemnation she expected from religious teacher, he offered her living water, kind that would spring up from within her own soul and become source of satisfaction that no earthly relationship could provide or destroy. Eternal spring that would never run dry regardless of circumstances or human failures that had taught her not to expect permanence or faithfulness from anyone who claimed to care about her welfare and happiness. By time their conversation ended, this woman who had come to well burdened with secrets and sorrow left her water jar behind and ran back to very town, where she had been living as something of outcast, so excited about her encounter with Jesus that she could not contain news that had to be shared with anyone willing to listen to testimony of someone whose life had been transformed by meeting one who knew everything about her but chose to offer grace instead of judgment. "Come and see man who told me everything I ever did," she announced to people she had been avoiding. Could this be Christ we have been waiting for? Her transformation was so evident, her joy so authentic and contagious, that many Samaritans came to believe in Jesus simply because of her testimony, proving that divine love recognizes no boundaries of ethnicity or gender or social standing that humans use to divide themselves from one another and from God who created all people in his image. Chapter 8. Fellow seekers of peace, as we pause here together in our sacred journey through life and love of Jesus Christ. My dearest companion on this path of peace that we have been walking side by side, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something beautiful and profound that has been happening in quiet chambers of your heart as we have breathed together same holy air that surrounded Jesus as he moved among people of this time. As we have witnessed together same revolutionary love in action that continues to transform hearts in our own day, including yours as you rest here in gentle embrace of this peaceful evening that has become sanctuary for your weary soul. You are not alone in this experience of encountering divine love through these timeless narratives that speak to every generation with fresh power and relevance that transcends cultural boundaries and historical distances. All around our world tonight, other souls exactly like yours have found their way to this same place of refuge. Other weary hearts seeking same comfort you are discovering. Other searching spirits drawn by same longing for peace that brought you to this quiet space, where modern urgency gives way to ancient wisdom and contemporary anxiety dissolves in presence of eternal love. There is something profoundly moving about this invisible community of seekers that has formed around these sacred stories. This fellowship of hearts that spans continents and cultures, united not by geography or background, but by shared recognition that our souls were made for more than endless cycle of stress and striving that characterizes so much of modern existence. That our hearts contain chambers that can only be filled by connection with love that never fails and never abandons and never grows, weary of extending grace to those who have exhausted their own resources. Some who join us tonight are longtime pilgrims whose feet have walked these pathways of faith for many decades, whose hearts have been seasoned by years of learning to distinguish between voice of divine love and countless other voices that compete for human attention, whose spirits have been strengthened by countless encounters with grace, that has proven itself faithful through seasons of abundance and seasons of scarcity, through times of clarity and times of confusion, through moments of triumph and long dark nights when hope seemed distant as stars hidden behind storm clouds. Others may be newer to this kind of spiritual seeking, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed in earlier chapters of their lives, drawn by longings they can barely name but cannot ignore, pulled by hunger that has grown stronger with each passing year that has taught them earthly pleasures alone cannot satisfy God-shaped emptiness within every human heart. Sacred hollow that can only be filled by connection with Source from which all souls come and to which all souls are ultimately destined to return. Whether you arrive here as seasoned pilgrim, whose feet are familiar with these ancient pathways of contemplation, or as curious newcomer, taking tentative first steps into territories that feel both foreign and mysteriously familiar, like landscapes glimpsed in dreams that seem more real than waking life. You are equally welcome in this community of hearts that recognize their need for something beyond what visible world can provide, something deeper than temporary pleasure or fleeting success, something truer than shifting sands of human opinion. The very fact that you have chosen to spend these precious evening hours in contemplation of eternal things rather than consuming entertainment that demands nothing of your heart or mind speaks to something beautiful awakening within you. Some deep recognition that your spirit was made for more than endless cycle of work and worry that consumes so many lives, that your heart was designed for communion with love itself, rather than settling for cheap substitutes that promise much but deliver little. Tonight we are about to continue our journey alongside most remarkable person who has ever drawn breath upon this earth, witnessing love in its purest form as it moved through our world in human flesh, touching lives and transforming hearts in ways that continue to ripple through time like stones dropped into still water that create circles, spreading far beyond point where they first disturbed surface. We will not observe these sacred events from safe distance of academic study, but will experience them as beloved friends, allowing our hearts to be opened by same love that opened hearts of fishermen and tax collectors, of prostitutes and religious leaders, of anyone who encountered this extraordinary man. If these stories of Jesus' compassion toward outcasts and sinners have stirred something beautiful in your spirit, if his interactions with children and tax collectors and fishermen and all ordinary people who found in his presence extraordinary grace they had been seeking without knowing where to look, if his patient love for confused disciples who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes yet were chosen for purposes that exceeded their understanding has helped you believe that you too might be worthy of such tender acceptance, then I want to extend to you same invitation that Jesus offered to everyone whose path crossed his. You are invited to become part of our growing family of fellow seekers who have discovered that spiritual rest is not luxury reserved for those who have achieved some level of spiritual maturity or theological understanding, but necessity as fundamental to human flourishing as food and water and air. That these quiet moments of encounter with divine love are not optional additions to life that can be postponed until more convenient seasons, but essential nourishment for souls created for relationship with their Maker. By choosing to walk with us through these contemplative narratives, by allowing your heart to be touched by same love that transformed fishermen into apostles and tax collectors, into evangelists and skeptics, into believers who were willing to sacrifice everything they had, previously considered important for sake of something infinitely more valuable, you become part of something that transcends individual experience and becomes participation in eternal story of divine love, pursuing human hearts across every barrier. Your presence in this community matters more than you might realize, dear friend, because when you open your heart to receive divine love through these ancient stories, You create ripples that extend far beyond your individual experience to bless everyone whose path intersects with yours, in days and weeks and months ahead. Everyone who encounters in your eyes something of peace you have found, who hears in your voice something of hope you have received, who senses in your presence something of love that has claimed you as its own. Please know that your thoughts and reflections about this journey we are sharing together, your own experiences of encountering Jesus, through these stories that speak across centuries to address needs that remain essentially unchanged despite all technological advances and cultural developments that have transformed external circumstances of human existence while leaving deepest hungers of human hearts exactly as they were when Jesus first spoke words of comfort to crowds gathered on Galilean hillsides are deeply valued and warmly welcomed. Sometimes people hesitate to engage with spiritual content in public forums, wondering if their faith is strong enough, or their understanding deep enough, or their questions sophisticated enough to contribute meaningfully to conversations about divine love and eternal truth that seem to require expertise they have not acquired or credentials they do not possess. But remember, disciples we have been observing throughout these stories, ordinary men with extraordinary flaws who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes, yet were chosen by Jesus and entrusted with most important message in human history. Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort for present struggles and challenge for future growth. Your struggles connect you to universal human experience of wrestling with doubt and disappointment that has characterized every generation since first human beings discovered that paradise lost is not easily regained through human effort alone, but requires divine intervention that comes as gift rather than reward. In continuing chapters of our journey together, we will explore deeper dimensions of Jesus' relationship with his disciples, witnessing transformation that divine love accomplishes in hearts that remain open to its influence despite their imperfections and failures and moments of doubt that prove they were human beings rather than spiritual automatons. Real people with real struggles who found in Jesus' presence reality more powerful than their problems and love more reliable than their own strength. We will witness opposition that Jesus faced from religious and political authorities who felt threatened by his message of unconditional love and radical acceptance that challenged systems built on exclusion and hierarchy. Observing how divine love responds to hatred with forgiveness, to violence with peace, to rejection with persistent offer of relationship that never gives up hope for redemption, even in hardest hearts. Most importantly, we will walk together through final week of Jesus' earthly ministry, experiencing with him ultimate demonstration of divine love that willingly embraced suffering and death for sake of human redemption, witnessing resurrection that proved love stronger than death and hope more enduring than any earthly circumstance. Discovering for ourselves what it means to be loved with love that will never end, accepted with acceptance that will never fail, held by arms that will never let us go. Chapter 9, The 12 and Their Stories. As reputation of this carpenter-turned-teacher continued spreading throughout Palestine like morning light, gradually illuminating landscape that had been hidden in darkness. Reaching into villages where his name was whispered around cooking fires and his deeds discussed in synagogues where learned men struggled to categorize someone who fit no existing rabbinical pattern. Jesus recognized growing need for companions who could share not only in his daily ministry, but in his deeper mission of demonstrating divine love to a world that had almost forgotten what such love looked like, when clothed in human flesh and expressed through human relationships. From among larger group of followers who had begun gathering wherever he went, drawn by teachings that spoke to longings buried so deep in their hearts, they had almost forgotten such longings existed. attracted by healings that restored not just physical function, but hope for futures worth living, inspired by presence that somehow made ordinary moments feel sacred and common encounters seem charged with eternal significance. Jesus chose 12 men to serve as his apostles, his sent ones, who would eventually carry his message to ends of earth. These 12 were not kind of men that religious establishments typically selected for positions of spiritual authority or institutional leadership. Not polished scholars who had mastered intricate details of scriptural interpretation through years of study in prestigious schools, where theological degrees were earned by memorizing commentaries written by previous generations of experts. Not socially prominent figures whose endorsement might lend credibility to new movement, or whose financial resources might provide security for organization that would need material support. Instead, Jesus chose ordinary working men whose hearts remained tender enough to recognize divine love when it called their names and invited them into adventure beyond anything their limited imaginations could have conceived. Whose souls had not been hardened by success that might make them feel self-sufficient or cynical about possibilities for transformation that seemed too good to be true, to minds that had learned to expect disappointment rather than hope for fulfillment that actually satisfied deepest longings. Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter with prophetic insight that looked beyond present instability to future strength that would be forged through failures that taught him complete dependence upon divine grace rather than human determination, brought to their fellowship passionate intensity of natural leader, whose enthusiasm often exceeded his wisdom, but whose love for his master ran deeper than sea from which he had drawn his living for so many years. Deeper than any human relationship he had ever experienced or imagined possible. Peter possessed kind of personality that spoke first and thought later, that acted on impulse rather than careful reflection, that promised more than human strength could deliver, yet somehow always found reserves of divine grace sufficient for whatever challenges love placed before him when he learned to depend not on his own resources but on power that worked through weakness rather than despite it, that accomplished divine purposes through human frailty rather than human strength. His journey from fisherman to fisher of men would take him through depths of failure that would have destroyed lesser souls and heights of faithfulness that would inspire countless generations of believers who would find in his story encouragement for their own struggles with inconsistency and hope for their own potential despite present limitations that seemed to disqualify them for spiritual service or divine purposes that required stronger characters than they possessed. Andrew, Peter's younger brother, brought quieter but equally devoted heart to their fellowship, possessing kind of personality that preferred to work behind scenes rather than in spotlight that attracted his more dramatic sibling, whose greatest joy came not from public recognition of his own contributions, but from introducing others to teacher who had changed his life in ways that made him want to share that transformation with everyone he met regardless of their background or circumstances. Andrew had gift of seeing potential in unlikely people and creating opportunities for them to encounter Jesus personally, beginning with his own brother and continuing throughout their years together with consistent ministry of connection that built bridges between seeking hearts and love. They were seeking without always knowing how to find it, or whether they deserved it, or what it might cost them to receive it fully and completely. His faithful service behind scenes, his willingness to take secondary role while his brother received more attention and recognition, his persistent efforts to bring others into circle of divine love rather than focusing on his own advancement or spiritual development, demonstrated kind of humble greatness that Jesus consistently praised above dramatic gestures that impressed crowds but sometimes concealed pride that sought glory for itself. James and John, sons of Zebedee, whose father had built successful fishing enterprise that provided comfortable living for their family until Jesus called them to abandon nets and boats for adventure that would prove far more rewarding than any material success they might have achieved by continuing in commercial fishing. Carried nicknames that revealed their fiery temperaments and quick reactions to anything that seemed to threaten or dishonor their beloved master. These brothers earned title Sons of Thunder because of their readiness to call down divine judgment upon anyone who failed to receive Jesus with proper respect or showed insufficient appreciation for teachings that seemed so obviously true and beneficial. That opposition could only be explained through willful blindness or deliberate wickedness that deserved immediate and severe punishment rather than patient instruction that might eventually open closed minds and soften hardened hearts. Their passionate natures served them well in some situations where righteous indignation was appropriate. Response to injustice or boldness was needed to proclaim truth in hostile environments, but their reactions often required redirection from destructive impulses toward constructive expressions of their zeal for divine honor and human welfare that would bless rather than burden those they were meant to serve with love rather than judgment. Under Jesus' patient influence that never tried to crush their spirits, but rather channeled their energy into forms that would serve divine purposes, their capacity for righteous anger would be transformed into equally passionate love that would eventually cost them everything they had to give in service of others, who needed what they had received through their relationship with one who had loved them enough to call them from comfortable mediocrity into glorious danger of living for purposes larger than personal satisfaction or individual security. Philip approached discipleship with careful, analytical mind of someone who liked to understand things thoroughly before committing himself completely to courses of action that might prove costly or difficult to reverse once begun, whose practical nature sometimes struggled with supernatural dimensions of following Jesus, but whose intellectual honesty kept him asking questions until he found answers satisfactory enough to justify continued participation in movement that challenged many assumptions he had held about how divine power operates in human affairs. When Jesus tested Philip's faith by asking how they could possibly feed a crowd of 5,000 people with resources that seemed laughably inadequate for such enormous task, Philip immediately began calculating costs and logistics with systematic precision that revealed his organized approach to problem solving, but also his inability to conceive solutions that transcended ordinary human resources and conventional methods for addressing overwhelming needs that appeared impossible to meet through normal means. His questions were never frivolous or designed to create difficulties, but reflected genuine desire to understand principles that govern relationship between human effort and divine provision, between natural means and supernatural results, between faith that trusts completely and wisdom that plans carefully for contingencies that might arise when good intentions encounter practical obstacles that could derail even worthy projects unless adequate preparation has been made. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, initially approached Jesus with skepticism of someone whose knowledge of geography and prophecy made him doubt that anything significant could emerge from village as insignificant as Nazareth. His honest questions revealing not cynicism but genuine desire to understand truth, not rejection of divine revelation but careful evaluation of claims that seemed too wonderful to believe, without adequate evidence that could satisfy both heart and mind seeking authentic encounter with living God rather than human fabrication. When Jesus demonstrated supernatural knowledge of his character and activities, describing him as true Israelite in whom there was no deceit, Nathanael's skepticism dissolved into worship that was all more profound because it had been preceded by honest doubt rather than uncritical acceptance of extraordinary claims that required faith to embrace fully. His transformation from skeptic to believer became pattern for many who would encounter Jesus through honest questioning rather than superficial agreement. Matthew brought to their group unique perspective of someone who had collaborated with Roman authorities for personal profit, who understood corruption of occupying power from inside its system, who knew what it meant to be despised by his own people for choices that had enriched him financially while impoverishing him spiritually and socially, cutting him off from community life and religious fellowship that gives meaning to existence beyond mere accumulation of wealth. His transformation from tax collector to apostle became living proof that no past was too shameful, no reputation too damaged, no heart too hardened to be reached by divine love and restored to usefulness in kingdom of heaven, where former enemies become beloved friends and former outcasts become honored members of family that includes everyone willing to receive grace freely offered to all, without regard for worthiness or merit or previous behavior that might disqualify them. Thomas, forever remembered primarily for his post-resurrection doubts rather than his pre-crucifixion courage, actually demonstrated tremendous loyalty and bravery throughout his years with Jesus, volunteering to accompany his master back into dangerous territory where religious authorities had threatened his life, showing kind of devotion that was willing to risk everything for love of one who had become more precious than life itself to hearts that had discovered meaning beyond survival. His questions and uncertainties arose not from lack of love, but from desire to understand completely, to have solid foundations for faith that could withstand testing and persecution and inevitable challenges that would come to anyone who chose to follow Jesus in a world often hostile to divine love and suspicious of claims that challenged established order and comfortable assumptions about how things should work and who deserves divine favor. Simon the Zealot represented yet another background entirely, bringing to their fellowship perspective of someone who had been involved with political resistance movement that sought to overthrow Roman occupation through force and revolutionary violence. His presence among 12 alongside Matthew, who had collaborated with very forces. Simon had opposed demonstrating Jesus' ability to unite people whose natural inclinations would have made them enemies under any other circumstances. Living in daily contact with these 11 very different personalities, each carrying his own baggage and expectations and misunderstandings about what it meant to follow Rabbi, who spoke of kingdom that operated according to principles completely different from any earthly kingdom they had ever known or imagined. Jesus demonstrated what it meant to love people, not because they were perfect, but because love itself is perfect. Not because they deserved affection, but because divine affection flows toward human hearts, regardless of their worthiness. He saw through Peter's impulsive bluster to his genuine devotion, appreciated Andrew's humble service even when it received little public recognition, channeled Sons of Thunder's passionate energy toward constructive purposes rather than destructive expressions of zeal that might harm rather than help those they encountered. Patiently answered Philip's analytical questions, while gradually expanding his understanding beyond purely rational categories, welcomed Thomas's honest doubts as opportunities for deeper faith rather than evidence of spiritual failure. The disciples observed Jesus handling every conceivable situation with wisdom and grace that never seemed forced or artificial but flowed naturally from his perfect understanding of human nature and divine purpose. Watching him respond to hostile questions without losing patience or compromising truth, witnessing his interactions with women and children and outcasts that revealed divine love's consistency, regardless of social status or cultural expectations that might suggest some people matter more than others. They noticed that his private character matched his public teachings in ways that gave absolute credibility to everything he claimed about divine heart toward humanity, that he practiced what he preached, not as performance for their benefit, but as natural expression of who he was in deepest places of his being where divine nature and human nature existed in perfect harmony without tension or contradiction or struggle between competing desires or loyalties. Through countless ordinary moments and extraordinary crises, through seasons of popularity when crowds followed them everywhere, and periods of opposition when enemies plotted their destruction, through miracles that filled them with wonder and teachings that challenged their assumptions, these 12 men were being transformed from collection of individuals pursuing separate agendas into community of friends, united by shared love for one who had called them out of their former lives into adventure beyond anything they could have imagined when they first heard his voice calling their names, beside sea that had defined their world until he expanded their horizons to include entire Earth. Chapter 10. Opposition and persecution. As Jesus' influence expanded throughout Palestine, like ripples spreading across still water, reaching into every corner of Jewish society where his teachings challenged assumptions that had been accepted without question for generations, and his presence inspired hope for changes that threatened established order built upon carefully maintained balances of power and privilege. Religious and political authorities who benefited from existing arrangements began to recognize this carpenter from Nazareth not as welcome spiritual reformer whose message might strengthen their institutions, but as fundamental threat to systems through which they maintained control over populations, who had grown accustomed to looking to them for guidance about divine will and earthly responsibility. What had begun as curiosity about new teacher, whose methods differed from established rabbinical traditions, gradually hardened into skepticism about claims that seemed too extraordinary to accept without more evidence than miraculous healings could provide, then evolved into active opposition that sought to discredit his authority through public challenges, designed to expose weaknesses in his theology or contradictions in his practices that would justify dismissing him as dangerous deceiver whose influence needed to be contained before it spread too far among people whose enthusiasm for his message was already creating problems. The Pharisees, who had built their entire identity around meticulous observance of religious law that distinguished them from common people they considered less spiritually disciplined and theologically informed, found themselves increasingly disturbed by Jesus' apparent disregard for traditions they held sacred as essential expressions of covenant faithfulness that separated God's people from surrounding nations, whose moral standards and religious practices represented everything faithful Jews were supposed to reject as incompatible with divine revelation given through Moses. When his disciples picked grain on Sabbath to satisfy hunger that made concentration difficult during long day of ministry that had begun before dawn and might not end until well after sunset, when he healed sick people on day designated for rest that was supposed to be kept holy through abstinence from work that included medical practice, according to interpretations developed by scholars who had spent years defining boundaries between necessary and unnecessary activities. When he ate meals with tax collectors and sinners without ensuring proper ceremonial cleansing, he was challenging not just their practices, but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to honor divine commandments. Their objections to Jesus' behavior were not merely petty criticisms of minor infractions or expressions of personal animosity toward someone whose popularity threatened their influence, but sincere expressions of concern about what they perceived as dangerous, departures from scriptural authority and ancestral wisdom that had preserved Jewish identity through centuries of foreign occupation and cultural pressure to conform to Gentile customs that would eventually destroy everything that made them distinct as chosen people called to be like to nations through faithful obedience to revealed truth. They had dedicated their lives to learning complex requirements of religious law that govern every aspect of daily existence, from food preparation to business practices to social relationships, creating elaborate systems designed to help ordinary people avoid accidentally violating divine commandments whose transgression might result in spiritual contamination that would separate them from holy God, who could not tolerate sin in any form or degree. Protecting divine honor through careful observance of regulations that built fences around biblical precepts. Jesus' casual attitude toward their protective traditions seemed to them like dangerous carelessness at best and blasphemous rebellion at worst, suggesting either ignorance of divine requirements that any properly educated teacher should understand, or deliberate contempt for authority structures that God Himself had established through Moses and maintained through legitimate religious leadership that bore responsibility for interpreting and applying eternal principles to contemporary situations that required wisdom accumulated through centuries of study and discussion. His responses to their criticisms revealed heart issues behind their theological objections, exposing how easily religious devotion could become religious pride that valued system more than purpose it was meant to serve. How quickly concern for divine honor could transform into concern for personal reputation that depended upon being recognized as especially faithful by others whose approval had become more important than divine approval that comes to those who understand that mercy triumphs over judgment. When He told them that Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for Sabbath, He was turning their understanding of divine purpose upside down in ways that challenged everything they had been taught about proper priorities and spiritual values that should govern relationships between Creator and creation, between divine requirements and human needs, between eternal principles and temporal applications that must be flexible enough to serve love rather than rigid enough to crush spirits that divine law was meant to liberate. The Sadducees, who controlled temple operations and their lucrative financial arrangements, while maintaining careful political relationships with Roman authorities that allowed them to preserve relative autonomy in religious matters, as long as they prevented disturbances that might attract unwanted attention from imperial administrators who had little patience for local customs that seemed to interfere with efficient governance, saw Jesus primarily as threat to delicate balance they had achieved between spiritual responsibilities and political realities. Their opposition was motivated more by practical concerns about institutional preservation than by doctrinal disagreements about theological interpretations. Though they certainly disagreed with many aspects of His teaching that seemed to undermine authority structures through which they exercised influence over populations whose religious activities generated revenue, essential for maintaining temple services and supporting priestly families whose livelihood depended upon continued functioning of sacrificial system that Jesus appeared to be challenging. They understood better than most how precarious their position had become under Roman rule that tolerated local religions only as long as they posed no threat to imperial interests or social stability that required cooperation from local leaders who could be trusted to maintain order among populations that might otherwise require military intervention to prevent rebellion or civil disturbance that would be costly for Rome and catastrophic for Jewish people who had already suffered enormous losses during previous conflicts. The scribes and teachers of religious law, whose authority rested on their expertise in interpreting ancient texts and applying scriptural principles to contemporary situations, found themselves intellectually threatened by someone who taught with direct authority rather than citing other authorities to support his positions, as was customary among rabbis who built their teachings on foundations laid by previous generations of scholars and interpreters who had established accepted methods for deriving truth from sacred writings. Jesus didn't need to reference earlier rabbis or quote established commentaries to validate His teachings, because He spoke with immediacy of personal knowledge, revealing divine truth with clarity that made their elaborate scholarly debates seem irrelevant and their careful academic distinctions appear insignificant compared to transforming power of simple truth spoken with authority that came from perfect relationship with Heavenly Father whose will he knew intimately and whose heart he revealed completely. Their professional identity was built on being recognized experts in matters of religious law and spiritual interpretation, ones to whom ordinary people looked for guidance about proper belief and acceptable behavior that would please God and secure His blessing. Jesus' ability to teach profound truths in simple language that connected directly with human hearts bypassed their mediating function, making their specialized knowledge seem unnecessary and their authority appear questionable in ways that threaten both their livelihood and their sense of purpose. The opposition intensified as religious leaders began testing Jesus with carefully crafted questions, designed to trap him in contradictions or force him to make statements that could be used against him either in religious courts or before Roman tribunals that had power to impose severe penalties, including death for those found guilty of sedition or blasphemy that threatened public order or imperial security, that took precedence over local religious concerns. They asked about paying taxes to Caesar, hoping to make him choose between alienating Jewish patriots who resented foreign taxation and giving them grounds to accuse him of encouraging rebellion against imperial authority that would bring swift and terrible retaliation against anyone suspected of seditious activity. They brought cases like woman caught in adultery, demanding judgments that would require him to choose between mercy and justice, between compassion and legal compliance that might expose him as either too soft to enforce divine law or too harsh to embody divine love. Time after time, Jesus' responses demonstrated wisdom that transcended human cleverness, revealing divine understanding that could satisfy deepest requirements of both justice and mercy, both truth and love, both respect for legitimate authority and compassion for human weakness that deserved understanding rather than condemnation, forgiveness rather than punishment that crushed spirits already wounded by their own choices and others' cruelty. Chapter 11. The Final Journey to Jerusalem. The time had come for Jesus to set his face steadfastly toward Jerusalem, and everyone who knew him could sense the profound shift in his demeanor as he prepared for what he understood with divine clarity would be his final journey to the holy city, where prophets had always come to deliver their ultimate messages and often to die for truths that religious establishments found too threatening to tolerate. Where the greatest demonstration of divine love in human history would soon unfold before a world that desperately needed to witness such complete self-sacrifice, offered freely for the sake of human redemption. The relaxed pace that had characterized his Galilean ministry, with its gentle rhythms of teaching beside lake shores, where crowds gathered like families around beloved teacher, whose words brought comfort to troubled hearts and hope to discouraged spirits, was drawing to its close as he gathered his disciples for pilgrimage that would transform everything they thought they understood about divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory that looks like defeat and strength that expresses itself through weakness. His closest followers, men who had walked with him through countless villages where his presence had brought healing and restoration to lives broken by disease and sin and despair, that had seemed permanent until divine love proved stronger than every force that opposes human flourishing, recognized that something fundamental had changed in their master's attitude and approach to ministry that had previously seemed like pleasant journey through countryside, filled with opportunities to demonstrate God's goodness to people who needed evidence that they were loved. There was new intensity in his prayers that lasted longer and seemed to penetrate depths they could not fathom. Deeper urgency in his teaching that pressed against hearts with weight of eternity, concentrated into words that would have to sustain his followers through trials they could not yet imagine. Quality of purposeful determination that seemed to pull him toward Jerusalem despite obvious dangers that awaited him there like storm clouds gathering on horizon that everyone could see, but no one could prevent. The disciples followed with growing uneasiness that mixed excitement about accompanying their Master to Holy City during most important religious celebration of Jewish year, with increasing anxiety about what such journey might cost them personally in terms of safety and security. Had found in relatively peaceful ministry among villages of Galilee, where people generally received them with gratitude rather than hostility, with openness rather than suspicion, that characterized atmosphere in Judea, where religious opposition was more organized and political sensitivity was heightened. Some walked close behind Jesus, trying to catch fragments of his prayers as he communed with Heavenly Father about mission that was reaching its climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into experience so terrible that even divine strength would be tested to its limits. Their hearts troubled by words they occasionally overheard about suffering and death that made no sense in context of kingdom they had been expecting him to establish through demonstrations of irresistible power. Others hung back in group, whispering among themselves about wisdom of this journey that seemed like march toward certain disaster, wondering whether following Jesus to Jerusalem might be final mistake that would cost them everything they held dear, including their lives and futures and families who depended on them for support and protection in a world where being associated with condemned criminal could bring persecution and suffering upon everyone connected to his movement, whether they had participated in whatever crimes might be charged. Word of Jesus' approach spread ahead of them like wildfire racing across dry grassland, reaching villages and towns along their route where people came out to see this teacher, whose reputation had traveled throughout Palestine and beyond its borders into regions where stories of his miraculous healings and revolutionary teachings had created expectations that varied dramatically depending on what hearers hoped to find in someone who claimed authority over life and death, sickness and health, sin and forgiveness. Some came seeking healing for themselves or their loved ones, carrying sick children or elderly parents or disabled relatives who represented last hope for families that had exhausted every other resource in search of relief from conditions that had resisted all conventional treatments while consuming financial reserves and emotional strength that had once seemed adequate for normal challenges, but proved insufficient when confronted with extraordinary needs requiring extraordinary intervention. Others were simply curious about man who had become subject of so much discussion and debate among religious leaders who could not agree about his identity or significance, whose teaching seemed to contradict established interpretations of scriptural prophecy, while fulfilling expectations in ways that traditional messianic theories had not anticipated, whose methods of ministry challenged institutional authorities while demonstrating power that validated claims no mere human being should have been able to make. Many joined growing procession spontaneously, sensing that they were witnessing something historic that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come by those whose lives had been touched by encounter with divine love, walking among mortals in mortal form, participating in events that would mark decisive turning point in human history when eternal purposes intersected with temporal circumstances to produce outcomes that would affect every soul that would ever draw breath upon earth. Among those who joined their journey were people whose lives had been transformed by Jesus' ministry over previous years, former outcasts who had been welcomed into his fellowship, healed individuals whose restoration had become permanent testimony to divine power working through human weakness, families whose children had been blessed by his touch and whose hearts had been changed by his teachings about divine love that embraces everyone, without regard for social status or moral performance or religious credentials. But there were also those who followed with darker intentions, agents sent by religious authorities to monitor Jesus' activities and report back on his movements and statements that might provide evidence for charges that could be brought against him in either religious or civil courts. Roman officials concerned about any gathering that might become politically disruptive. Curiosity seekers whose interest was more entertainment than transformation. All creating atmosphere of tension, even in midst of celebration. As they approached Jerusalem, Jesus made arrangements to visit Bethany, small village where his close friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had welcomed him many times before, providing place of refuge and authentic fellowship that offered respite from demands of public ministry that never allowed complete privacy or total relaxation from responsibilities that weighed heavily on his human heart, even as his divine nature remained. Perfectly at peace with Father's will and eternal plan, unfolding exactly as it had been determined before foundation of world was laid. But this visit would involve more than rest and refreshment, becoming instead stage for most dramatic miracle of his entire earthly ministry, raising of Lazarus from dead after 4 days in tomb. Demonstration of power over death itself that would send shockwaves throughout region and provide final evidence of his divine nature that would either convince honest seekers or harden opposition of those whose hearts had already been closed to truth. No amount of evidence could penetrate or overcome. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, he found household in mourning, with Martha and Mary grieving loss of their beloved brother and wondering why Jesus had not come sooner, why he had allowed someone he loved to die when his presence could have prevented such tragedy that had plunged their family into sorrow and their community into sympathy for loss that seemed so unnecessary and premature, given his power to heal and restore and make whole what had been broken by living in a world where things go wrong. Their questions revealed kind of honest wrestling with divine purposes that characterizes authentic faith. Struggle to understand how divine love can coexist with human suffering, how divine power can permit losses that seem preventable and unnecessary, to human understanding that cannot see larger picture or comprehend ways that even death serves purposes of love that transcends earthly life and temporal relationships that matter deeply but are not final word about meaning and purpose and eternal significance. Chapter 12. The Last Supper and Betrayal. In an upper room that had been carefully prepared according to specific instructions that revealed Jesus' supernatural knowledge of events about to unfold, and his divine control over circumstances that seemed to be spiraling toward catastrophe, but were actually proceeding according to eternal plan that would accomplish salvation through means that appeared to guarantee destruction. As shadows lengthened over Jerusalem and golden light of oil lamps began to flicker against stone walls that would witness the most intimate and heartbreaking scene in all of human history, Jesus gathered with his 12 chosen companions for what he knew with terrible certainty would be their final meal together. The Passover celebration that spread before them on low table, around which they reclined according to custom for festive meals that commemorated freedom from bondage, carried accumulated weight of centuries of tradition, each ritual element connecting them to their ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt, through miraculous intervention that demonstrated God's power over oppressive forces and his willingness to rescue his people when their situation seemed hopeless. Each prayer and symbolic food reminding them of divine faithfulness to covenant promises that had sustained Jewish identity through generations of wandering. Tonight, these ancient symbols would be invested with entirely new meaning as Jesus transformed this memorial of past deliverance into foundation of future salvation that would extend beyond ethnic boundaries to embrace all humanity in scope of divine love that knew no limits based on race or culture or social status or moral performance. That typically determined who was considered worthy of divine favor according to human standards that reflected pride more than grace, exclusion more than inclusion, judgment more than mercy. as they shared intimate fellowship that had sustained them through 3 years of ministry together. Traveling from village to village where Jesus' teaching and healing had transformed countless lives while gradually building opposition from religious authorities who felt threatened by his influence over populations they had previously controlled through careful maintenance of complex systems designed to regulate every aspect of spiritual life, according to interpretations that served institutional interests more than divine purposes or human needs. There was atmosphere of both celebration and underlying tension. Jesus seemed simultaneously peaceful and deeply moved, speaking with intensity that suggested these words carried eternal significance while displaying tenderness that revealed his infinite love for these imperfect men who had walked with him through miracles and controversies, triumphs that had lifted their spirits and disappointments that had tested their faith. Moments of clarity when divine purposes seemed obvious and periods of confusion when nothing made sense, except their commitment to follow wherever he might lead them. Before they began formal meal with its prescribed rituals and familiar prayers that connected every Jewish family to shared history of divine deliverance and ongoing hope for ultimate restoration of all things, according to divine purposes that transcended individual understanding but could be trusted because they flowed from wisdom and love that never failed those who committed their lives to divine will. Jesus rose from his place at table and did something so shocking that it reduced his disciples to stunned silence. He removed his outer garments with deliberate care that suggested profound significance in every action, wrapped towel around his waist like common servant preparing for menial labor, poured water into basin that would normally be used by household slaves for washing feet of guests, whose sandaled journey through dusty streets had left them in need of cleansing before they could properly participate in sacred meal, and began to perform work that even servants often tried to avoid because it placed them in position of such humiliation. Peter's protest was immediate and vehement, his voice expressing shock and embarrassment that they all felt at witnessing such divine humility, such complete reversal of every normal understanding of authority and respect that governed relationships between teachers and students, masters and disciples, leaders and followers who were supposed to serve rather than be served by those whose superior wisdom and spiritual development entitled them to honor rather than requiring them to humble themselves before others. When Jesus gently insisted that Peter could not understand significance of what was happening until later when events would illuminate truths that were hidden in present darkness but would become clear in light of resurrection, that would transform their understanding of everything they had witnessed during their years with him. Peter's response was characteristically absolute in its swing, from one extreme to another without finding middle ground that might have been more appropriate. After Jesus finished washing their feet and returned to his place at table, he made lesson explicit while demonstrating through actions principles he had been teaching through words throughout his ministry that consistently emphasized service over domination, humility over pride, love over law that could become burden when divorced from grace that makes obedience expression of gratitude rather than attempt to earn favor from God, who gives his favor freely to anyone willing to receive it. As they began sharing Passover meal with its traditional elements and familiar prayers, connecting them to their spiritual heritage and divine promises that had sustained their people through centuries of testing and persecution and exile and return. Jesus took unleavened bread that commemorated their ancestors' hasty departure from Egyptian bondage and invested it with meaning that would echo through eternity as symbol of his body given for redemption of humanity enslaved to sin and death. "Take and eat," he said, breaking bread and distributing it among disciples who received these familiar elements with growing awareness that something unprecedented was happening, transforming ordinary meal into sacred covenant. "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Simple act of sharing food became profound symbol of divine love poured out completely for human salvation, establishing new relationship between heaven and earth. Similarly, cup of wine that traditionally represented joy and divine blessing became symbol of new covenant, sealed not with blood of sacrificial animals, but with Jesus' own life poured out for forgiveness of sins that separate human hearts from holy God, who desires relationship but cannot compromise his perfect righteousness, by ignoring rebellion that must be dealt with according to divine justice tempered by infinite mercy expressed through substitutionary sacrifice that satisfied both justice and love. But then atmosphere in room shifted dramatically as Jesus made announcement that sent shock waves through their intimate fellowship. Words that fell like stones into peaceful gathering and created ripples of confusion and distress that reached every heart around table where love had been celebrated and covenant established. "One of you will betray me," he declared with voice that carried both sorrow and certainty. And they began asking one by one whether surely he didn't mean them. Judas departed into darkness that seemed to symbolize spiritual condition of his heart, having made final choice between love and silver, between eternal treasure and temporary gain, between loyalty to one who had loved him completely and service to those who would use his betrayal for their own purposes before discarding him, like broken tool that had served its function and was no longer needed for their plans to eliminate threat to their authority and influence. After betrayer left them alone with their confusion and growing fear about what was coming, Jesus spoke more openly with his remaining disciples about separation they couldn't imagine surviving, and loss they couldn't believe was possible, trying to prepare them for trials that would test every assumption they had made about divine power and human loyalty. About earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes that often operate according to principles completely opposite from worldly wisdom and conventional understanding. Chapter 13. The Cross and the Crown. From peaceful intimacy of upper room, where love had been demonstrated, through service that reversed every human expectation about power and greatness, and covenant had been established through shared bread and wine that would forever after remind his followers of price paid for their redemption. Jesus led his disciples through sleeping streets of Jerusalem toward garden called Gethsemane, place of ancient olive trees where he had often retreated for prayer and communion with Heavenly Father, whose will he had come to accomplish regardless of personal cost that would test even divine nature to its absolute limits. The garden that had been sanctuary of peace during their previous visits, where solitude and natural beauty had provided perfect environment for contemplation and worship that refreshed his human spirit while strengthening his resolve to complete mission that had brought him from heavenly glory to earthly sorrow, felt different this night as they passed beneath branches, heavy with leaves that rustled in evening breeze like whispered prayers ascending toward stars that had witnessed countless human struggles, but none comparable to cosmic conflict about to unfold. Atmosphere was charged with sense of impending crisis that even disciples could sense, despite their incomplete understanding of what was approaching with each passing hour that brought them closer to events that would transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew about divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory that appears as defeat and strength that expresses itself through weakness that confounds human wisdom. Jesus' demeanor had changed from tender intimacy they had experienced during their final meal together to something heavier, more burdened by weight of divine mission as it reached climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into single experience of separation from Father's love that would be more agonizing than any physical torture human cruelty could devise, more devastating than death itself, because it would involve spiritual anguish that perfect holiness experiences when it comes into contact with moral corruption. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to point of death," he told Peter, James, and John, 3 disciples he had chosen to accompany him deeper into garden, while others waited at entrance where they could watch for approaching danger that he knew was coming, but which they hoped might somehow be avoided if they remained vigilant and prepared to defend their master against enemies who sought his destruction through methods that would ultimately serve divine purposes. His words revealed profound humanity of one who was fully divine, showing that incarnation meant experiencing complete range of human emotion, including anguish, so intense it threatened to crush even divine strength. Revealing that salvation would be accomplished not through divine power that bypassed human suffering, but through divine love that entered fully into human experience, including its darkest moments of testing and trial that would prove divine commitment to human redemption. "Stay here and keep watch with me," he requested with voice that carried both authority of divine command and vulnerability of human need for companionship. During hour when isolation would make agony even more unbearable, when loneliness would compound physical and spiritual torment into combination of sufferings that no human being had ever endured or ever could endure except for one whose perfect innocence made him capable of bearing guilt he had never earned while maintaining love for those whose guilt he was assuming. Moving beyond even these closest companions, whose presence provided some comfort, but could not share burden that was his alone to carry, Jesus fell face down on ground that received his prostrate form like altar prepared for sacrifice that would surpass every offering ever made in human history, his face pressed against earth that would soon drink his blood, while his heart broke under pressure of divine wrath against sin that he had never committed, but was willingly accepting. "My Father," he prayed with voice that carried agony no human throat had ever expressed, words torn from depths of divine nature, wrestling with human nature in perfect unity, yet perfect tension as two aspects of his being confronted reality of what perfect love was willing to endure for sake of imperfect creatures who deserved judgment, but would receive mercy through substitute, who would experience their condemnation, so they might experience his approval, if it is possible. "May this cup be taken from me," the cup he referenced in prayer that penetrated heavens and moved heart of eternal Father, whose love for his Son was matched only by his love for lost humanity, was not merely physical death that would end his earthly ministry in pain and humiliation, but spiritual agony of bearing humanity's sin in his own person, experiencing separation from divine love that sin creates, drinking full measure of divine wrath against human rebellion while maintaining perfect love for those whose rebellion he was taking upon himself. Yet even in this moment of ultimate testing, when human nature recoiled from suffering that lay ahead, and divine nature grieved over necessity that made such suffering unavoidable, if love was to triumph over justice without compromising either attribute of divine character, Jesus concluded his prayer with words that secured redemption of everyone who would ever believe in him as substitute for their sins and source of their righteousness before God, who accepts Christ's perfect obedience in place of their disobedience. "Not as I will, but as you will," he surrendered with submission that revealed perfect harmony between Father and Son, even in a moment when that harmony would be temporarily broken by sin-bearing that would separate them in ways that had never occurred in eternity past and would never occur again in eternity future, making this moment unique and divine experience as love embraced suffering for sake of creatures who could never repay debt they owed. 3 times he prayed this prayer of ultimate surrender, and 3 times he returned to find his disciples sleeping, despite his request that they keep watch with him during hour of greatest need when human companionship might have provided some small comfort to ease isolation that made spiritual agony even more unbearable. Their failure revealed human inability to comprehend or participate in depths of what divine love was willing to endure for their salvation. As Jesus emerged from his final time of prayer, face radiant with peace that comes from complete surrender to divine will, despite costs such surrender would require, strengthened by angelic ministry that had been sent from heaven to prepare him for ordeal ahead, while confirming Father's approval of Son's willingness to drink cup that had been prepared for him. Sound of approaching footsteps and flickering torches broke garden's sacred silence with harsh intrusion of human hatred into divine love's moment of supreme preparation. Judas arrived leading crowd of soldiers and temple guards, armed with swords and clubs, as if they were arresting dangerous criminal, whose followers might attempt violent resistance. Rather than teacher whose only weapons had been words of love and acts of compassion that had brought healing to thousands and hope to countless others who had discovered in his presence what divine love looked like when it walked among mortals in mortal form, whose only crime had been demonstrating divine mercy in ways that threatened earthly power. The betrayal was accomplished through kiss, traditional greeting between rabbi and disciple perverted into signal for arrest, intimacy weaponized for treachery, trust transformed into most infamous act of betrayal in human history that would forever after serve as warning about what happens when hearts choose silver over loyalty, temporary gain over eternal treasure, fear over faith that trusts divine promises, even when circumstances suggest reasons for doubt. Yet even in this moment of ultimate rejection by one of his chosen companions, Jesus called Judas friend and asked why he had come, extending grace to very one who was delivering him to his enemies, offering love even to heart that had chosen material reward over spiritual relationship, demonstrating mercy toward one whose betrayal would accomplish divine purposes, while destroying betrayer's soul through guilt that no amount of silver could ease. When Peter drew sword in futile attempt to defend his master through violence that contradicted everything Jesus had taught about responding to evil with good, to hatred with love, to aggression with peaceful resistance that trusted divine power rather than human strength, Jesus immediately healed ear that Peter had severed from high priest's servant, while rebuking this attempt at armed resistance that would have justified Roman retaliation against all his followers. The trials that followed were travesties of justice from beginning to end, conducted by religious leaders who had already decided on their verdict and were merely seeking legal justification for predetermined conclusion that would eliminate threat. Jesus posed to their authority over populations who were beginning to question whether traditional leadership truly represented divine will or merely human ambition disguised as spiritual devotion that served institutional interests more than divine purposes. Chapter 14. The promise fulfilled in profound silence that followed Jesus' death. Silence broken only by weeping of women who had loved him and awed whispers of witnesses who recognized they had observed something unprecedented in human experience, something that challenged every assumption about power and weakness, victory and defeat, life and death, that governed human understanding of how divine purposes operate in world that often seems abandoned by any benevolent force capable of intervening on behalf of those who suffer through no fault of their own. Very fabric of creation seemed to hold its breath as earth and heaven processed completion of most significant event in human history. The Roman centurion who had supervised countless executions during his military career, professional soldier accustomed to witnessing death in its most brutal forms without allowing emotion to interfere with duty that required him to maintain order among crowds that gathered to watch public punishment designed to deter crime through display of consequences that awaited those who challenged imperial authority, found himself compelled to acknowledge what he had observed during these 3 hours when darkness covered earth and temple veil was torn and rock split as if nature itself was responding to an event that transcended natural categories. Surely this was righteous man, he declared with conviction that surprised him because it emerged from depths of his being where truth resided. Despite years of training designed to suppress such responses in favor of professional detachment that allowed soldiers to perform their duties without being paralyzed by moral qualms or emotional reactions that might interfere with effectiveness required for maintaining imperial order through force when necessary and fear when force was not immediately available. According to some accounts that circulated among early believers whose testimonies were carefully preserved by those who recognized their historical significance, the centurion went even further in his acknowledgement of what he had witnessed, declaring with authority earned through years of observing human behavior, under extreme stress that revealed true character when all pretense was stripped away. Truly this man was Son of God. Words that carried weight because they came from someone who had no religious or political motivation to make such statement, but was simply reporting what his trained eye had observed during execution that differed from every other execution he had supervised in ways that defied natural explanation. As evening approached and Sabbath drew near according to Jewish reckoning, that began new day at sunset rather than sunrise, creating urgency for proper burial procedures that had to be completed before Holy Day, commenced with its restrictions on work that included handling dead bodies. Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy member of ruling council who had been secret follower of Jesus throughout his ministry but had lacked courage to publicly identify himself with teacher whose popularity among common people was matched by hostility from religious authorities, finally found strength to act according to his convictions, regardless of personal cost. This was a moment that required him to choose between safety that came from remaining hidden among those who opposed Jesus and integrity that demanded he honor in death the one he had followed in secret during life. Between preserving his position and reputation among colleagues who had condemned Jesus as blasphemer deserving death and acknowledging publicly his belief that this condemnation had been unjust, between maintaining comfortable anonymity and accepting risks that came with open discipleship. His request to Pilate for permission to bury Jesus' body properly, rather than allowing it to be thrown into common grave reserved for executed criminals whose families could not afford private burial or whose crimes had made them outcasts even in death, was act of considerable bravery that publicly identified him with condemned man and could have resulted in loss of his position, unruling counsel, damage to his reputation that might affect his business relationships, possibly even criminal charges if authorities decided his request indicated seditious sympathies. But love compelled him to ensure that Jesus received honorable burial befitting his true identity as Son of God, whose death had accomplished salvation for all who would believe, rather than disgraceful disposal that would add final insult to injuries he had suffered during crucifixion that had been designed not merely to kill, but to humiliate, to break spirit as well as body, to serve as public deterrent that would discourage others from challenging authority that possessed power to inflict such terrible punishment. Together with Nicodemus, another member of religious establishment who had first come to Jesus under cover of darkness to avoid being seen by colleagues who would have questioned his interest in teacher, whose methods challenged their authority and whose message threatened their comfortable assumptions about divine approval based on external performance. Rather than heart transformation, Joseph carefully removed Jesus' body from cross that had become altar where perfect sacrifice was offered. They wrapped body in linen cloths with expensive spices that cost them considerable sum, but represented investment in hope that death was not final word in story of one who had claimed power over life and death, who had promised resurrection that seemed impossible according to natural laws, but might be possible according to supernatural power that had demonstrated itself through miracles they had witnessed during his ministry among people who had experienced healing and restoration that defied medical explanation. The tomb where they laid Jesus' body was new one that Joseph had prepared for his own eventual use, carved from solid rock in garden near place of crucifixion, sealed with massive stone that would require several strong men to move under normal circumstances, guarded by Roman soldiers who had been posted there at request of religious authorities who remembered his predictions about rising from dead on third day and wanted to prevent disciples from stealing body and claiming resurrection have occurred. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, watching from distance as he died while noting carefully where his body was laid so they could return after Sabbath to complete burial preparations that had been performed hastily due to time constraints imposed by approaching holy day observances, planned to honor him with final act of devotion that their love made necessary, even though their hearts were breaking with grief that seemed unbearable and their faith was shattered by apparent failure. The Sabbath passed in crushing sorrow for Jesus' followers who huddled together behind locked doors, overwhelmed by grief and confusion that made them question everything they thought they understood about divine purposes and human destiny, struggling to process apparent collapse of dreams that had sustained them through 3 years of following one who had seemed to possess power over every force that oppressed and destroyed human happiness, but had somehow been defeated by very forces he had challenged most directly. But while they mourned what appeared to be ultimate victory of hatred over love, death over life, despair over hope that had seemed so bright and beautiful during days when Jesus had walked among them, bringing healing to sick and comfort to mourning and good news to poor, who had been forgotten by everyone else, but were remembered by divine love that noticed every need and responded to every cry for help with grace sufficient for every circumstance. Something unprecedented was stirring in tomb where his body had been laid. Early on first day of week, before dawn had fully broken over Jerusalem, still sleeping in aftermath of Passover, celebration that had been overshadowed by execution that had shocked even those who had demanded it, Mary Magdalene made her way to tomb carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body. Her heart heavy with sorrow, but her devotion compelling her to perform final act of service for one who had transformed her life by freeing her from demons that had tormented her, and giving her purpose and identity and hope she had never imagined possible. When she arrived at Garden Tomb, she discovered something that challenged every assumption about permanence of death and finality of separation that death creates between those who remain and those who depart. Something that would transform her grief into joy, her despair into hope, her questions into certainty about divine love's ultimate victory over every force that opposes human flourishing, and divine purposes that will not be defeated by temporary appearances of failure. The massive stone that had sealed entrance was rolled away, not from outside as if someone had broken in to steal body, but from inside as if someone had broken out, lying at angle that suggested it had been moved not by human strength, but by supernatural force that made its weight irrelevant, its security meaningless before power that recognizes no barriers, when love determines to demonstrate its victory over death itself. Chapter 15. Until we meet again in peace. Here at gentle conclusion of our sacred journey together through life and love of Jesus Christ. As peaceful darkness of night settles around you like most comforting embrace that speaks of divine care for every detail of your existence, and your breathing naturally deepens into rhythm of blessed rest that comes from knowing you are held by arms that will never grow weary of carrying you through every trial and every joy that awaits you in days ahead. I want to pause with you in profound gratitude for these precious hours we have shared, walking together through most beautiful and transformative story ever told, experiencing together love that has changed countless hearts across centuries, and continues changing hearts tonight. We began this evening with you carrying whatever burdens today had placed upon your shoulders, perhaps feeling overwhelmed by responsibilities that seemed to multiply faster than your strength to meet them, possibly questioning your worth or wondering if there truly existed love in this universe that knew your name and cared about your deepest needs and longest struggles that sometimes feel too heavy for human heart to bear without breaking under weight of disappointment and discouragement that accumulates like dust on traveler's cloak, making each step more difficult. We conclude with you resting securely in embrace of that very love we have encountered together, surrounded by truth that you have never been alone and never could be alone, because you are cherished beyond your ability to comprehend by one who spoke galaxies into existence, yet pays attention to every whispered prayer and silent longing of your heart that may feel insignificant when compared to cosmic forces and global events, but matters infinitely to divine love that measures significance not by size, but by depth of care invested. The Jesus we have met together in these quiet hours is not merely figure from ancient history, confined to pages of old books or memories of civilizations that have crumbled into dust, but living presence who reaches across every barrier of time and space to touch tired hearts exactly like yours, to offer rest to weary souls exactly like yours, to extend forgiveness and acceptance to imperfect people exactly like you and me, who need grace more than we need anything else this world could offer. His love transcends historical boundaries and cultural limitations, to meet you in your present circumstances with same tenderness that characterized his interactions with disciples who disappointed him and crowds who misunderstood him and enemies who betrayed him, yet never exhausted his capacity for forgiveness or diminished his commitment to their welfare despite their treatment of him during years when he walked among them, demonstrating what divine love looks like when it takes human form. The cross we witnessed together was not simply tragic end to beautiful life cut short by human jealousy and religious pride that could not tolerate challenge to established authority and institutional power, but ultimate demonstration of divine love willing to pay any price for human redemption. Definitive proof that there is no depth of human need that divine grace cannot reach, no darkness so profound that divine light cannot penetrate it, no heart so broken that divine love cannot heal it completely. The resurrection we celebrated together revealed that this love is not merely beautiful sentiment that comforts grieving hearts but has no power to change actual circumstances, not wishful thinking that helps people cope with harsh realities, but offers no genuine hope for transformation, but victorious power that conquers every enemy of human happiness and divine purpose. Eternal reality that proves stronger than death and more enduring than time itself. Permanent transformation available to anyone willing to receive what they cannot achieve. If this sacred journey has brought even moment of genuine peace to your troubled heart, that has been carrying anxiety and worry like stones in pocket that grow heavier with each passing day, if these ancient stories have awakened something beautiful in your spirit that had been sleeping under weight of disappointment and discouragement that accumulated through experiences of broken promises and failed relationships and dreams that died slow deaths. If you have found yourself breathing more freely or feeling more connected to love that holds universe together, then you have discovered treasure worth guarding against every force that would steal or destroy. This treasure is meant to be shared with others who are walking same pathways of seeking and struggling that you have walked, who are carrying same burdens of loneliness and fear and confusion that you have carried, who are asking same questions about meaning and purpose and hope that you have asked during seasons when life seemed empty of divine presence and barren of divine purpose. Your testimony about what you have received through these quiet hours will carry weight in conversations with family members and friends and acquaintances who need to hear from someone they know and trust that divine love is real. This community of fellow seekers that has formed around these contemplative stories represents something precious and rare in our modern world that often seems designed to fragment attention and fracture peace that souls desperately need for spiritual health that enables physical health and emotional health and relational health that makes life worth living, rather than mere survival from one disappointing day to another, hoping that tomorrow might bring fulfillment that today had promised, but failed to deliver. By joining our family through subscription to continued journey together, by participating in conversations that form when hearts risk vulnerability, and share honestly about their spiritual experiences and discoveries, you become part of something that transcends mere content consumption to become fellowship with people who understand that slowing down reveals more truth than speeding up toward destinations that may not be worth reaching if process destroys souls that were created for joy. Your voice matters tremendously in sacred conversation we maintain together across continents and cultures. Your reflections and experiences adding unique threads to tapestry of testimony that encourages every heart that encounters it to believe in possibilities for transformation and healing that divine love makes available to anyone whose heart remains open to receiving what pride would reject and fear would refuse, and cynicism would dismiss as too good to be true when it is actually too good not to be true. Please know that your thoughts about this journey we have shared together tonight, whatever particular moments in Jesus' story have spoken, most directly to your own need for hope or healing or forgiveness, or simply assurance that you matter to someone whose love never fails, are deeply valued and warmly welcomed in comments, where hearts can share honestly about their spiritual journeys without fear of judgment from those who think they have progressed further along pathways that all lead to same destination. Sometimes people hesitate to engage with spiritual content in public forums, wondering if their faith is strong enough, or their understanding deep enough, or their questions sophisticated enough to contribute meaningfully to conversations about divine love and eternal truth that seem to require expertise they have not acquired through formal education or spiritual credentials they do not possess through institutional affiliation. But remember, disciples, we have observed throughout these stories ordinary men with extraordinary flaws. Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort for present struggles and hope for future possibilities that seem impossible according to human limitations, but become possible through divine power working in cooperation with human faith that trusts completely even when understanding remains incomplete. Your struggles connect you to universal human experience of wrestling with doubt and disappointment. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits, journeying together through experiences of saints and mystics who discovered divine presence in desert silences and mountain solitudes. Learning how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths and provide practical wisdom for contemporary challenges that sometimes seem insurmountable but are never beyond reach of grace. Feel now how your body has naturally released every remaining tension that was holding muscles tight and nerves on edge, how your breathing has slowed to gentle rhythm of someone who knows they are safe in presence of love that never sleeps or slumbers but watches over you with care, that notices every detail of your existence and responds to every need before you are even aware that need exists, how your heart has found its natural pace of rest as sleep begins to claim your consciousness, carrying you from wakefulness into blessed unconsciousness, where divine love continues its healing work in regions of your soul too deep for conscious awareness to reach, but not too deep for divine grace to penetrate, with restoration that happens during rest when defenses are lowered and Hearts are open to receive gifts they might refuse during waking hours. Let your final conscious thoughts be filled with gratitude for love you have encountered. You are falling asleep tonight, not merely into natural rest that restores physical energy, but into everlasting arms that have held every believer who has ever found peace in divine love, every heart that has ever been healed by divine grace, every soul that has ever discovered their true identity as beloved child of God, who created them for relationship with Himself and destines them for eternal joy in all that discovered their true identity as beloved child of God, His presence where every tear will be wiped away. Sweet dreams, precious child of divine love, knowing you are beloved beyond your ability to understand, accepted beyond your ability to earn, held by love stronger than death and more enduring than time itself, that will never let you go, regardless of what storms may come, or what challenges may test your faith, or what changes may occur in external circumstances that cannot touch eternal relationship you have with one who knew you before you were born. Until we meet again in this sacred space where weary hearts find rest and searching souls discover home they have always been seeking. May you know beyond any doubt that you are treasured, you are valued, you are exactly who divine love created you to be, and you are destined for more beauty and joy and purpose than your heart can currently imagine but will experience fully when perfect love casts out all fear and perfect peace surpasses all understanding. Rest now in perfect peace, surrounded by perfect love, held by perfect grace that covers every imperfection and transforms every weakness into strength, every failure into learning, every ending into new beginning, filled with possibilities as infinite as love that created you and will never stop believing in wonderful person you are becoming through divine transformation, working patiently until that day when faith becomes sight and hope becomes reality and love becomes everything you have always known it was meant to be. Good night, dear one, and may divine love fill your dreams with visions of glory that awaits you. May angels watch over your sleep with protection that never fails. And may you awaken tomorrow refreshed not only in body, but renewed in spirit, ready for another day of walking in love that makes every ordinary moment sacred and every simple act of kindness participation in divine purposes that extend far beyond what eyes can see or minds can comprehend, but hearts can know. Through faith that trusts completely in love that never fails. Amen and amen.